This meeting is being recorded.
Vamos tentar depois também legendar mais tarde em português. Prontos, mas vamos então em frente. Aliás, eu queria primeiro agradecer a oportunidade de estarmos aqui ao convite do Museu da cidade de Lisboa. Não sei se... eu peço desculpa, aliás, por ter vindo um pouco de atraso. O meu computador resolveu que ia fazer um update. Então eu estava aqui um bocadinho em pânico, mas consegui chegar. O meu nome é Steven Lupkeman, sou coordenador do SlaveWrecks Project, co-coordenador. O outro coordenador, penso que também está aqui, junto connosco, o meu colega, o Paul Gardulo, do Smithsonian, e temos aqui outros também que vou apresentar pelo menos alguns dentro de pouco. Mas a Raquel, Joana, não sei se vocês tinham alguma palavra a dizer sobre, ou se já falaram, ou se já deram uma introdução geral, mas eu passava-vos primeiro a palavra antes de ir em frente com a minha introdução.
Força, Joana.
Eu? Ok. Então, boa tarde a todos. Estamos na hora daqui. Bom dia aí. E muito obrigada por esta oportunidade, também com as mesmas palavras do Steve, por estarmos aqui juntos a trabalhar sobre este tema e ter a oportunidade de aprender uns com os outros. Agradeço primeiro à Raquel Masqueiro o convite, porque partiu dela, para que o Museu de Lisboa se pudesse associar à disseminação por mais pessoas, tanto os que estão a participar e a assistir a hoje, como aqueles que depois vão ver a gravação desta sessão, sobre uma apresentação do SlaveWrecks Project e também sobre algum do trabalho que o Museu de Lisboa tem vindo a desenvolver desde 2017, mais centrado na escravatura, nos testemunhos da escravatura em Lisboa ao longo dos séculos, bem como vários outros convidados, não só os que pertencem à equipa do SlaveWrecks Project, mas outros de várias correntes académicas, de investigadores e de colegas nossos de outros museus, que depois o meu colega coordenador do Serviço de Investigação deste museu, Paulo Almeida Fernandes, irá coordenar, irá moderar na parte da tarde. Por isso acho que não vou tomar mais do vosso tempo, porque o fundamental será feito a partir de agora pelo Steve Lupkeman e por todos os elementos da equipa que vão desde a África do Sul ao Brasil, passando pelos Estados Unidos, e naturalmente também teremos a apresentação da própria Raquel Masqueiro. Muito obrigada ao Steve, à Raquel e a todos, e até já no debate.
Muito obrigado. Raquel, do you want to add?
Só secundar os agradecimentos ao Museu por proporcionar esta iniciativa e esperar que seja só a primeira de muitas. Vamos em frente.
Okay, muito bem. Thank you very much. We will pivot now into English, if that's okay. We will, going forward, try to be bilingual, and anybody who needs translation, please feel free to ask for it. And we will do our best. I will do my best to provide that. So today is an interesting moment, and this is an opportunity that has been in the making for some time, and we appreciate your coming and joining us today as we talk about the slave shipwreck, the slave voyage and the shipwreck of the São José Paquete África, which many of those on this call will be talking about the role that they have been playing in the research that's being conducted on that story and on that history. At the same time, we want to be able to place that into a broader context and ask, why is it that matters? So I just want to take a few remarks. You're going to have an opportunity to hear from the different individuals who have been playing a role in bringing this story and recovering this history to life. And I'm not going to spend too much time doing that. I've been fortunate to be part of this team, to work with many of the individuals that you will hear from as one of the primary investigators on this particular project, but also as the coordinator of the 𝐧𝐼𝐻 project. So, you know, the journey of the São José Paquete África began in 1793, actually, I'm sorry, in 1794 in Lisbon. And early in that year, we have a cargo manifest, and it ended at the very end of that year in a tragic shipwreck that occurred off of the Cape of Good Hope in current day South Africa, in a small place today known as Camps Bay. As the presentation by my colleague Jacob Boshoff from 𝐂𝐧𝐼𝐻 Museums of South Africa will be able to give you more details on the story of that voyage and on the fate of those who were on that ship, and over approximately half of those who were enslaved coming from Mozambique and headed to Maranhão, Brazil, perished in that voyage. So in a certain way, this voyage ended in 1794, but as a matter of social memory and history, that voyage has continued. And really this presentation here, these presentations today will be about reflecting on the trajectory of that voyage since 1794. And for a long time, that voyage was one that was marked by social amnesia and forgetfulness. The São José Paquete África, like so many other slaving voyages, receded into sort of those parts of the archive and what we might call the footnotes of forgotten history. And in fact, it was a footnote in an archive that referred very briefly on the part of a Dutch colonial administrator to a Portuguese slaver that had gone down on a particular date in December of 1794 that began this investigation. And really, there was no name, there were no names, there was nothing other than this brief one-sentence footnote. And for hundreds, well over 100 years, that was what the São José Paquete África had in some sense become, a footnote in history. And I think that thinking about the last 10 years, this meeting today represents a way in which that journey has picked up on that footnote and expanded and continues to expand. The São José, in some sense, has undertaken a new journey over the last decade, one back into social memory and into engagement with the legacies of the slave trade. And you're going to hear today from those who have made this more recent etapa, this more recent stage of the São José's journey possible. And I'm going to introduce those folks very briefly to you. I should add that there are yet others, but this has only been possible because of the work of people working on, in essence, 4 different continents. So Yolanda and Ricardo Duarte will be talking to you a little bit today about the work that they have been doing in Mozambique, inclusive of in the interior, a location that we have strong reason to suspect was actually directly associated with the enslaved that were on board the São José, certainly enslaved that were taken in the same year and that had ties actually to the Portuguese crown. Jacob Boshoff, my colleague, will have a presentation that's recorded today, and he sends his regards. Jaco is the primary archaeologist on the site where the shipwreck occurred in South Africa. He's not able to join us today because of the death in the family, but the work that 𝐂𝐧𝐼𝐻 Museums of South Africa has been doing will be highlighted here. My colleague Reinaldo Barroso from Brazil, this was the intended destination in Maranhão. As a result of work that has come out of this particular project, has really brought to light some rather amazing insights into those ships that did make it and the lives of those enslaved who came from Mozambique after the São José and were able to reach that destination. My colleague Paul Gardullo will be talking as a senior curator and the co-director of the project, 𝐧𝐼𝐻 project, but also senior curator in the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, will be able to talk to you a little bit about a voyage that some of the artifacts are currently taking, how it is that they have play a role in telling the story of the slave trade writ large to an audience of what have now been millions of people who've come through the museum and millions others who now have access through digital story maps. And then my colleague, Kamal Siddiqui, who is joining us today, who has really played a very special role in the memorialization of the São José Becket Africa, but will be able to speak to you a little bit about sort of the significance of this to a much broader community and a much broader set of work that is being undertaken, not least of all by the organization that he has played such an important role in, that is part of the 𝐧𝐥𝐢𝐬𝐴 project, Diving with a Purpose. And then last but not least, my colleague Raquel, who's been taking the archival work in some sense on the São José, and really working with colleagues at the museum and colleagues also with the organization 𝐻𝐵𝐺 and elsewhere to look into how this story has in fact been forgotten and what that means in the Portuguese context. And so I'm pleased above all to be able to introduce you to these folks, these people who are part and parcel of bringing the next stage of the voyage of the São José Becket Africa. Let me just reflect very briefly. You know, the story of the São José is in many ways, it's not really significant in its own right. Or it should be more accurate to say that it's not more significant than any of the other voyages that took place during the slave trade. It happens to be the one that we have this kind of access to, but it's important in what it allows us to think about and engage with respect to that much broader story. If you go to the slave voyages database online, you'll see that there are in excess of 40,000 voyages, and by some estimates, that's less than half. The São José is just one. You know, and the 200 souls who were lost on that, and the other 200 who survived and were later re-enslaved, are individuals that are representative of many, many, many millions of people. And I think that the story of the São José, I would invite us to think a little bit about, is significant in trying to understand all of those other stories that have not been told. It is a point of entree, a way for us to try to grasp something about this world that was created by the slave trade. Also to understand the world we live in and how it is related and built upon that world. And I think last and not least, how much of that relationship between our current world and the world of the slave trade, those linkages have been forgotten. And what does that mean? What does that mean, and what should we do about it? Raquel, can you throw up for real quick? I have just a couple slides, and I'm going to run through these very quickly. Okay, we can move to the second one. I'd like to talk to you just very briefly. You know, the São José is significant to the 𝐧𝐥𝐢𝐬𝐴 project in some sense because it's the sort of our first effort, but really because it has opened up the space for the 𝐧𝐥𝐬𝐴 project itself to build a network of collaborators that can take on this broader task of recovering the past, of using maritime archaeology to try to access a forgotten past, to think critically about what that forgetting means, and then to think about what we should do about it. And so for those of you who are not familiar with the 𝐧𝐥𝐬𝐴 project, we're an international network of researchers that's growing, hosted by the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture and co-directed with George Washington University. We have several global partners, including 𝐂𝐨𝐧𝐼𝐻 Museums of South Africa, the U.S. National Park Service, and Diving with a Purpose. But the network really spans what is a very rapidly growing list of national and regional partnerships in South Africa, in Mozambique, in Senegal, in Brazil, St. Croix, and a number of specific collaborations that may themselves grow into bigger partnerships in places like Portugal and Cuba and Angola. Could I have the next slide, please, Raquel? That's fine. Where we work, the next one, please. Thank you. You know, I think one of the important things, and I would just take a 1 minute to say that it's not simply the thematic, what we're trying to do in terms of recovery of the past, but what's important is to understand also that the signature approach of the SlaveWrecks project is one that really emphasizes certain ways of differentiating itself from the way research in archaeology has been conducted in many ways in the past. And amongst those things that are really important for us, and I won't take much time, I'm glad to answer questions later, are really to focus on really different types of partnerships, ones that involve really trying to help our partners build their own institutional capacity, working with them and learning from them as well. But really rethinking the notion of international collaboration on much more equal footing, and in some sense highlighting the possibilities for building a network in which our partners, wherever they may be, are in a position to build sustainable programs that can go forward and that can pursue an agenda in which they take a leadership. This also involves deep engagement with stakeholder communities. Some of these may be communities that are stewards of sites like in Mozambique Island, and others may be communities that are descendant communities like those in Alabama who are the descendants of those who survived the voyage on the Clotilde. Really, I'm sorry? Yes, also public engagement and dissemination is extremely important, as important as scholarship is. And we are really committed to expanding and diversifying participation in the field. And we have several programs that are really working on increasing the possibilities for our colleagues, in particular from Africa and the African diaspora, to play a significant role in telling this story. Can I have the next slide? Different types of global impact. You can see sort of an emphasis here on really reaching into and speaking to a broader public. And this is one of the things that we really welcome in this opportunity today. And I'd like to finish. I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm hearing noise in the background. Can I have the last slide? And I'd like to just finish with this thought, you know, why the SlaveWrecks project? And to some extent, having worked on this particular shipwreck that we're going to talk about today, this particular story, I've come to see the São José in some sense as a metaphor for the task that the SlaveWrecks project writ large is trying to do and trying to encourage others to take up as well. You know, in certain ways, I mentioned that the site, the location where the shipwreck occurred is in Camps Bay. And Camps Bay is perhaps one of the most expensive pieces of real estate on the African continent. And many of those mansions there that belong to you know, foreign political figures and movie actors and so forth, some of those are quite likely built literally upon the graves of the 200 who died in that shipwreck. And I think in some ways that is it's a strong metaphor for the ways in which both the present has been built upon foundations of inequality in the past, but also how that's been forgotten. You know, it was interesting to talk to Albie Sachs, the famous human rights lawyer who has a home there and never knew of this story. You know, this had been forgotten. And I think that the inequalities of the present are founded upon inequalities in the past, and we can see in the São José site in its location a metaphor. I think the fact that this was a mere footnote, and today you'll see that the research has taken it in some sense much further, it offers us up a metaphor for understanding what this task is, right? It's a task of challenging silences. And you can see a picture here, and you know, silences, history is made in many ways more by what is forgotten and repressed than what is remembered. And I think we will find in sort of some of the presentations, for example, by Raquel, talking about how it is that the traitor, José Antonio Pereira, has been remembered, and what's been forgotten about him offers us an understanding of how history is put together. and what we need to do to challenge that. And part of that is challenging the silences. And part of that is also really reaching out and giving voice to others who might want to participate and bring a different perspective to bear, whose voices have been silenced in creating this history. And finally, I would say, to a certain extent, you know, the site, I think I'm one of maybe 2 people on this call who's been diving on this actual site as a maritime archaeologist. And it's an incredibly difficult site. You may think, oh, this is in Southern Africa, it's warm. It's not. These are polar currents. I've often talked a little bit about this as being akin to trying to dive in a washing machine full of ice cubes. It's incredibly hard. It's incredibly challenging. The wildlife is not friendly. You may have seen National Geographic pictures of sharks jumping up and hitting seals. Those locations where they film those are visible from this site. You know, it's frustrating. You go in, you uncover sand, and you come back on the next dive, and it's back there yet once again. And I think that in some sense is also very metaphoric. It's very emblematic of the task that we face. It's often the task of recovering the past, of making people think about the past in new ways that are uncomfortable, of thinking about the links between those pasts and the presents are ones that often occur in a hostile environment. They're ones that are 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. They're ones in which you uncover something and others are there trying to cover it back. And I think there are many ways in which I have experienced this site as a metaphor for what we are trying to do writ large in the Slave Wrecks Project, and for what we are trying to do with this story. The story in and of itself ultimately needs to engage with the past, the present created by the past, acts of forgetting, and challenge those acts of forgetting, provide opportunities for giving new forms of voice, and to think about those legacies in various different ways and how we challenge those legacies of the past and the present. I'll leave you with a final question before I pass the microphone on, which is, you know, in diving on the site, I wrote at one point in the book From No Return that those of us who dive on the site are quite aware of the fact that we are as close to the middle passage, the literal middle passage, that we are literally reaching out and touching that history. And it always comes and touches us back. And so I would invite each of you to think about this individually, to think about this as participants in your own societies. And, you know, our participants today will be talking not just about their research, but about what this research means and the story means in different places, ranging from Brazil to the US to South Africa. But then what does this mean to you? How will, you know, as you touch this site with us, how will it touch you back? So thank you very much. I'm looking forward to these presentations, and it is a real privilege to have you all here, and a real privilege to have my colleagues who've done so much work on this as international collaboration. Thank you.
So now we have the presentation by Ricardo and Yolanda. You have the floor. You need to unmute yourselves. And you can share your screen at will.
Tá, Raquel?
Sim.
Bom dia a todos, é um prazer estar aqui, é um prazer rever amigos que já não víamos há muito tempo, colegas de trabalho e de lutas também, e é com muito prazer que vou iniciar então a apresentação. Vou-lhe pedir para partilhar o ecrã comigo.
Pode partilhar, Yolanda, tem permissão.
Onde é que está? Partilhar tela. Desktop. Compartilhar. Está-me a pedir a preferências do sistema, não sei o que é isto. É a primeira vez que me acontece isto. Oh, Raquel, acho que não estou a conseguir, se calhar vou-lhe pedir para partilhar, só que aquela que eu lhe mandei tem um erro numa data logo no princípio, mas eu depois retomo.
Ok.
É porque não estou a conseguir fazer a partilha.
Deixa-me só localizá-las. Está aqui. Vamos fechar esta. E agora sim. Então, aqui é isto. Este mesmo.
Será que eu consigo mandar? Não. Portanto, eu vou falar um bocadinho sobre uma abordagem multidisciplinar, um bocadinho da investigação em Moçambique e também em Portugal, e ligar um pouquinho da investigação documental e também da arqueologia que foi feita em Moçambique. Peço o próximo slide, por favor. A maior parte destes documentos que vou mostrar é do arquivo histórico, da coleção do Conselho Ultramarino. São cerca de 267 caixas, mais de 25 mil documentos que não estão catalogados, ou melhor, a catalogação é uma catalogação parcial. Não há suporte em microfilme. Em Portugal, em Moçambique, existe o microfilme com todas as dificuldades que nós temos com a possibilidade de verificar os microfilmes. A maior parte do tempo a máquina infelizmente está variada, e também está em Maputo. O nosso centro está na ilha de Moçambique, temos alguma dificuldade a ter acesso a estes documentos, se não for em Portugal. O próximo, por favor. A investigação foi feita de 2013 a 2016, inicialmente só baseada no São José Paquete da África e depois alargada para uma investigação de uma aringa em Tete, que provavelmente poderá estar ligada com São José. Foram vistas as castas de 1740 a 1823, mas também outras que se achou pertinente. O próximo slide, por favor. Este é um dos primeiros documentos que encontramos e foi bastante importante. É um mapa da carga do São José à partida em Lisboa. Mostra-nos barras de ferro, que foi bastante importante para os arqueólogos na África do Sul. Mostra-nos também caixas de coral, azeite, aguardente, pólvora, secos, coisas secos, e velório, que são miçangas de contas de vidro. Portanto, isto é o mapa da carga do São José à saída de Lisboa. Próximo, por favor. Temos também a lista de equipagem. Aqui todos os oficiais e equipas que chegaram a Moçambique. Na verdade, chegaram no dia 27 de julho, e esta lista de equipagem foi feita a 31 de julho. O próximo, por favor. Isto é muito importante, eu gosto muito deste documento. Felizmente é muito grande só para as linhas de texto que é realmente importante, e fala-nos do impacto da chegada de um navio, neste caso o São José Paquete da África, e também do Flor do Funchal, que estaria para chegar em brevemente, em que aconselham que se venda as contas, as miçangas que têm nas alfândegas, nos armazéns da alfândega, imediatamente, porque irá fazer baixar o preço da miçanga à chegada destes navios. O próximo, por favor. Este é uma lista de cartas oficiais que são recebidas pelo capitão do navio, o João Manuel Pereira, e que se compromete a entregar na Secretaria de Pernambuco. Próximo, por favor. Entre eles iria uma carta patente, é original, Este é um pedido de uma segunda via, em nome de Elias José dos Ramos, em que diz que o original foi perdido durante o naufrágio em Cape Town. Próximo, por favor. Aqui é uma história interessantíssima, é a história de um escravo que pertencia ao Sheik de Mongiqual. Por qualquer motivo que se desconhece, um funcionário português ficou com o escravo, era um pouco vigarista, teve um caso em tribunal, prometeu que entregava este escravo como pagamento de uma execução judicial, não entregou, vendeu o escravo e foi um dos que embarcou no São José Paquete d'África. Próximo, por favor. Este documento é um documento que está um bocadinho em mau estado, mas consegue-se perceber algumas palavras que ainda estão visíveis. Fala-nos em príncipe, fala-nos em escravatura. Próximo, por favor. E digo isto porquê? Porque que seria importante? Porque nós sabemos que o São José Paquete d'África estava isento de direitos alfandegários sobre a escravatura. São dois documentos que nos referem precisamente isto. Próximo, por favor. E liga-nos um bocadinho a Tete. E a Tete porquê? Porque encontramos um documento em que nesse mesmo ano, em 1794, os habitantes da cidade de Tete e também os prazeeiros daquela zona entregaram escravos à coroa portuguesa. São 798 escravos e logo os primeiros temos a de Francisca Josefa de Moura e Menezes, que nesse ano entregou 80 escravos, e a sua irmã, Dona Isabel, que entregou cerca de 70 escravos. O próximo, por favor. E, em 2013, eu e Ricardo fizemos um trabalho de arqueologia salvaguarda nesta zona de Moatize. Está a haver alguma interferência? Nesta zona em Tete, um trabalho de salvaguarda, e queria mostrar um bocadinho desta investigação arqueológica que foi feita, e que junto ao rio Moatize, quadradinho, encontramos uma aringa. Na altura, tentámos saber, através das fontes orais, a quem pertencia. E só mais tarde, 3 anos, encontramos este mapa, não no Arquivo Histórico Ultramarino, mas sim na Biblioteca Nacional, que nos mostra que naquele lugar só poderia ser um prazo de tunda. E aí começámos a investigação, saber a quem pertencia o prazo de tunda, e reconstituir toda a história ligada com este prazo, porque seria um dos lugares prováveis de onde viriam os escravos para o São José Paquete d'África. E temos ali 2 prazos, um ao lado do outro, curiosamente pertenciam os 2 à Dona Francisca, que é o Nhamacance, a Dona Francisca Josefa de Moura e Menezes, que fizemos a reconstituição da história dela até à morte. Vamos próximo, por favor. Portanto, este prazo pertenceu primeiro ao seu marido, José Moreira Pereira. Sabemos, temos um documento que em 1764 o prazo da terra de Tunda pertencia ao José Moreira Pereira, e sabemos que a partir de 1783 pertenceu a Francisca Josefa de Moura e Menezes. Este documento é de 1803, próximo por favor, mas também temos a carta de Cismaria, da Francisca Josefa, uma mulher poderosíssima. Ela foi casada com 2 governadores, patrocinou a viagem do governador Lacerda de Almeida de Tete ao 𝐂𝐧𝐼𝐻. Uma semana antes da viagem casou a sua sobrinha, Dona 𝐿eocádia, com o governador, que morreu durante esta viagem. Ficou com a filha do governador, a Dona Isabel, com apenas 5 anos, em que ela não pretendia entregar a avó, mas sim criar a Dona Isabel para casar com um dos seus netos. Ela era tão poderosa que morreu velhinha, em 1823, e na data da sua morte houve a preocupação de fechar estradas para Tete, com medo de uma revolta dos escravos. Próximo, por favor. Portanto, aqui a carta de Sesmaria, que entrega por 2 vidas, aqui em segunda vida, por 3 vidas, esta é a segunda via, a Dona Francisca Josefa de Moura e Menezes. Próximo, por favor. E julgo que o próximo, aqui, curiosamente, a carta de Sesmaria, o original, ia para ser rubricada no Reino, acabou por ser perdida também num naufrágio à saída de Climane, da galera Ana Joaquina. Isto é mais uma das curiosidades acerca da vida dessa senhora e também dos documentos com ela correspondentes. O próximo, por favor. Próximo. E aqui está o lugarzinho em Tete, aqui junto ao rio 𝐂𝐧𝐧𝐼𝐻, bem longe, bastante afastados ainda da estação arqueológica. O Ricardo olhou para o tipo de árvores e para a configuração e disse: ali ao fundo está uma aringa, ali é uma estação arqueológica. Fiquei admirada porque não estava habituada a este tipo de árvores e de configurações, e explica-se porquê. Porque este tipo de árvores vem desta palafita que era feita em paus, e alguns destes paus acabavam por arrebentar, por germinar, e então foi por isso que se conseguiu ver ao longe que seria uma aringa. Uma aringa é uma povoação fortificada que se desenvolveu no Vale do Zambeze, nos séculos XVII, século XIX, houve alguns interregnos, mas o que é certo é que estas aringas estão muito ligadas ao comércio de escravos. Próximo, por favor. Nesta altura, quando encontramos, esta é a parte da aringa, os trabalhos arqueológicos foram feitos inicialmente em 2003, fez-se recolha de superfície e também fez-se uma sanja. Próximo, por favor. Encontrou-se bastante cerâmica de fabrico local, e que nos causou na altura, aqui é um trabalho em 2021, que acabámos por completar, de fazer as dimensões e o registro da aringa, em 2021, mas foi uma selfie esta foto. Próximo, por favor. E temos, julgo que a imagem seguinte será das cerâmicas. Raquel, a próxima, por favor. Aqui está a variedade do espólio, de tipologias. Agora, espera aí um bocadinho, de tipologias das cerâmicas que encontrávamos. A primeira explicação que nós dávamos era porque seria um encontro de local de escravatura, que várias pessoas de várias, não gosto muito do termo tribo, vou falar em etnias ligadas com Moçambique e por aqui, que poderiam fabricar aí. Foi a primeira explicação. Porém, em 2021, nós encontramos muito perto desta aringa, não nesta aringa, mas junto ao rio 𝐂𝐧𝐼𝐻, uma cerâmica muito importante. Foi descoberta pelo arqueólogo Paul Sinclair. Até 2010 nós só conhecíamos 3 estações arqueológicas com este tipo de cerâmica, que nós chamamos cerâmicas da tradição Lumbo, que é uma cerâmica pré-colonial do século XI ao século XIV. E em 2012 também a arqueologia de salvaguarda para a Vale Moçambique, junto à linha férrea, fizemos um levantamento e encontramos bastantes estações, cerca de 12 estações. O doutor Mariquida encontrou uma estação com este tipo de cerâmica no Vale de Zambeze, e agora, próximo, por favor, e agora encontramos em Tete. Aqui está. Portanto, podemos ver as 3 estações arqueológicas que eram conhecidas, era o Lumbo, Somaná, Foz do Lúrio. 2012 fizemos o corredor de Nacala, e agora temos esta cerâmica de fabrico local, que é predominantemente da costa, aparece-nos no Zambeze, desde a foz do Zambeze até ao sul da Tanzânia, e por dentro, pela via do Zambeze, aparece-nos então em Tete Moativ. É uma curiosidade, é também uma novidade, não está ligada ao São José Paquete de África, mas está ligada a esta interrelação de Tete, de Moatize, desta zona, a um comércio ligado com o Oceano Índico. E sobre isto agora vai falar um pouquinho o Ricardo, eu vou-lhe passar então a palavra.
Eu só queria fazer algumas considerações adicionais. Realmente a África Oriental esteve profundamente envolvida no comércio de escravos em épocas muito remotas, pelo menos desde a segunda metade do primeiro milénio. O comércio de escravos foi uma componente da extensa rede comercial do Índico, num contínuo durante séculos e séculos, até a abolição no século XIX. A introdução da cultura intensiva de cana-de-açúcar nas ilhas francesas do Índico, Maurício Reunião foi uma das principais forças motrizes do aumento dramático do comércio de escravos do Oceano Índico e subsequente circulação transatlântica dos escravos para as Américas através da Rota do Cabo. Foi neste contexto que, entre 1797 e 1824, mais de 400 navios de escravos atravessaram o Cabo a caminho do Novo Mundo. A ilha de Moçambique, no final do século XVIII, uma burguesia local de origem portuguesa, luso-indiana, luso-africana, desenvolveu-se muito no contexto do então frutuoso comércio de escravos para as ilhas francesas do Índico, e os nomes de armadores e traficantes de escravos, como os Monteiros, os Costa Soares, os Pereiras, são ainda hoje uma referência importante na historiografia e nas memórias dos habitantes da ilha. Os rendimentos significativos deste comércio proporcionaram uma forte ligação comercial entre os estabelecimentos comerciais da cidade do Cabo, que se desenvolveram principalmente após a ocupação britânica em 1895, e os armadores da ilha de Moçambique. De acordo com o historiador da cidade do Cabo, Patrick Harris, os estabelecimentos comerciais da cidade do Cabo, como os Hoggans, Hudsons e Tennants, constituíram uma das principais fontes de financiamento para este então florescente negócio de escravos. Concomitantemente, embora no século XVIII ainda a administração colonial portuguesa, no que é hoje Moçambique, estivesse ainda incipiente, tinha-se desenvolvido desde o século XVI um assentamento informal e uma estrutura sociopolítica sui generis no baixo Vale do Zambeze, desde a costa até a cidade de Tete, que era o sistema dos prazos, ou conhecido pelo sistema dos prazos, contando com enormes concessões de terras atribuídas à coroa portuguesa. A organização socioeconómica do sistema dos prazos dependia profundamente da escravatura, do trabalho de escravo, do qual o tráfico de escravos era uma extensão. Os ricos prazeiros estavam estritamente interligados por laços familiares e ligações comerciais com as famílias ricas da ilha e conjuntamente envolvidos na atividade do comércio de escravos. Viviam com os seus exércitos de escravos nas aringas, que a Yolanda referiu, povoações fortificadas. Normalmente a aringa principal, residência do senhor, tinha o mesmo nome do respectivo prazo. Em 2013 foram localizados e estudados os restos da aringa, os vestígios da aringa que a Yolanda referiu, longe, muito no interior de Moçambique, junto à cidade de Tete, localizada às margens de um pequeno rio, o rio Moatize, um afluente do Zambeze. Um mapa antigo da Biblioteca Nacional de Lisboa, que a Yolanda mostrou, permitiu identificar este lugar como a aringa de Tundo, importante povoação do prazo com o mesmo nome. Outras investigações nos arquivos forneceram documentos que possibilitaram uma reconstituição dos aspectos interessantes da história deste prazo, nomeadamente os principais proprietários e as ligações ao tráfico de escravos. Entre os proprietários deste prazo destaca-se essa interessante figura que a Irlanda referiu de Dona Francisca Josefa de Moura e Menezes. Dona Josefa foi uma proeminente figura influente da burguesia colonial da época, constituída por proprietários de prazos, senhores de guerra, comerciantes armadores e altos oficiais coloniais, que gravitaram no Vale do Zambeze, na ilha de Moçambique. Um dos maridos de Dona Josefa, que foram vários, foi José Moreira Pereira, um dos governadores da cidade de Tete.
Parece que estamos com problemas técnicos. Yolanda? Não sei se podemos avançar.
Estando lá na ilha de Moçambique, às vezes as ligações são um pouco difíceis. Acho que talvez seria melhor avançarmos, sim. So we seem to have a technical difficulty, and sometimes the connections with Mozambique Island are not ideal. So we will proceed with the next. And of course, Ricardo and Yolanda hopefully will be able to rejoin us later for discussion if you have additional questions. And of course, their full presentation will be available for anyone who's interested. Thank you.
I'm going to share the screen again with the presentation by 𝐿𝐼𝐼, who unfortunately cannot join us. Agora vamos então ver a apresentação do 𝐿𝐼𝐼.
In this paper, I'm going to give you a short history of the wrecking of the Portuguese slaver São José Paquete Africa. I will also give you an idea how we identified the shipwreck and some of the impacts of the project. The São José Paquete Africa left Lisbon on 27th of April in 1794 for Mozambique to take on board a cargo of slaves destined for the plantations in Maranhão, Brazil. On the way, the São José planned to stop at the Cape to replenish with food and water. On the night of 27th of December 1794, they found themselves in the vicinity of Clifton with a cargo of more than 500 slaves. A strong southeasterly wind prevented the ship from entering safe anchorage in Table Bay. The captain decided to hug the coast. This would turn out to be a poor decision. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the ship struck a rock and started taking on water. The captain ordered the crew to cast out an anchor, but the cables snapped. They dropped a second anchor and realized that the stern of the vessel was struck on a rock. The strong wind and surge broke this anchor as well, and the ship became trapped between two reefs. The crew then tried to use the ship's windlass and a third anchor to get the ship off the rocks, but this rope broke as well. They realized that they were close to the shore and sent a boat with slaves and crew ashore. This boat could not return due to the rough seas. In the meantime, a Dutch East India Company official from Cape Town arrived and rigged a basket on a rope to the ship, saving the lives of the sailors and more than half of the enslaved. The sea became so rough that the ship finally broke into pieces, resulting in 212 of the enslaved people perishing in the violent waves. At the Cape, the moniker Mosbiker or Masbiker was often attached to the enslaved people arriving from Mozambique. No distinction was made as to tribal grouping or otherwise. Names were not recorded on arrival, and new names were given. It is significant that we know so little about the fate of those enslaved in the São José compared to what is known about the surviving crew. Documents provide the names of every single crew member, but not one of the enslaved. What little we are told that 11 slaves who survived the wreck perished shortly thereafter, and that the other 200 were sold for 30 pieces of each, tells us far more about the mindset of the society that trafficked in people as commodities than it does about the enslaved themselves. The Mozambique or Musbika community was originally a distinct grouping in Cape Town slave community. However, under the weight of the discriminatory racial classifications of the apartheid era, many Musbikas de-emphasized their African heritage and assimilated into the broader Cape Town colored community. In the new South Africa, it remains to be seen how the recovery of the story of the 𝐭𝐳𝐧𝐼 might provide an opportunity for the revitalization of once lost histories and identities alike. While surviving records and testimony describe the ship's cargo and provide an account of her wrecking, no descriptions of the ship itself have been found. The final resting place of the ship has so far only provided fragmentary archaeological evidence. In part, this is because of the ship's very violent demise, as documented by the eyewitnesses who reported how the vessel broke apart on the rocky reef in a matter of hours. The massive swells that have rolled across the site for over 2 centuries have broken up the ship's remains even further. Without significant shipwreck remains, we have to estimate the size of the 𝐭𝐳𝐼. We can look at research done on other slave ships of the era and work out the area typically allotted to slaves, which was estimated to be about 60 square centimeters per person. We can consider other slave ships active in this period with known tonnage and number of slaves embarked. Over 75% of the 33 ships listed in the Transatlantic Slave Voyages database documented to have sailed with a comparable number of slaves between 450 and 550 persons. During the same decade as the 𝐭𝐳𝐼, were classified as between 315 and 400 tons. Tonnage is a very variable and not accurate measure, but we can estimate that the 𝐭𝐳𝐼 fell in the 300 to 400 ton range and was between 30 to 40 meters long. Currently, any dimensions must remain hypothetical, but the ranges nevertheless serve as a framework upon which to develop an informed understanding of the ship's likely fittings and layout. When we found the wreck, we found, amongst other things, copper sheathing and copper fastenings. We know that copper sheathing in the late 18th century was adopted by the slave trade with great aplomb. So this placed the ship more or less in the right date range. We also found the remains of very fragmentary shackles. Furthermore, we found iron ballast blocks, which also placed it into the 18th century or late 18th century from the shape and the size of the ballast. We also had archival evidence indicating that the 𝐭𝐳𝐼 did carry iron. But the final nail in the coffin for identifying the ship was the discovery of timber that was used for cargo, a very specific kind of timber, Dalbergia melanoxen, which is only found up in the east coast of Africa. Very hard, very durable timber that is quite scarce and very valuable. We also know that in that area there was only one other shipwreck of a much later date. So the conclusion finally was that there's a 99% chance that this is the 𝐭𝐳𝐼. We were fortunate to receive a large grant from the US Ambassador's Grant for Cultural Preservation, which enabled us to do a multi-beam survey of the site, look at sand levels and the currents over a period of time. Also looking at the conductivity of the ocean water, the dissolved oxygen and the biological activities on the site, which in this sense building up an environmental study of what the site looked like for a short period of time, and maybe in that way working out how to manage the site in the future. As mentioned before, we received funding from the US Ambassador's Fund to also upgrade the conservation laboratory, where we were able to purchase large equipment like a freeze dryer, XRF for elemental analysis, electrolysis equipment, and high-powered microscopes. But we also ran several public programs. We also did a social responsibility and memory program whereby we took soil from Mozambique and deposited it on the site as a memorial to the enslaved that perished on the site. We had several workshops of international nature on conservation and on the São José. But we also did a school education program that was funded by the US Ambassador's Grant, whereby we taught kids from disadvantaged communities about maritime archaeology, the slave trade, and maritime science. And finally, this culminated in an exhibition at the 𝐂𝐧𝐞 Slave Lodge, which is currently running. But this was preempted by an exhibition that is still running at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. Thank you. This presentation is a presentation of the SlaveRex project.
Okay. So now we have Reinaldo. Reinaldo? Pronto? Parece que estamos com problemas técnicos para o Brasil também. Se calhar passávamos outra vez para o Ricardo e para a Yolanda para terminarem muito brevemente. Até o Reinaldo se poder ligar novamente.
Muito obrigado. Eu estava mesmo a terminar. Resultado, essa famosa prazeira, que era a dona da Aringa de Tudo, a dona Josefa, casada com muitos, entre eles 2 governadores. Um dos maridos foi José Moreira Pereira, um dos governadores do estado de Tete. Os Pereiras eram uma importante família de traficantes de escravos, com vários ramos disseminados por Moçambique, ao Vale do Zambeze, e cuja lista não seria estranho, pensamos nós, ligar o nome de Manuel João Pereira, o rico armador e traficante de escravos da ilha de Moçambique, que era o proprietário do navio de escravos São José, Paquete da África. Ligado ou não por traços de parentescos com Dona Josefa, a verdade é que Manuel Pereira pertence ao mesmo número restrito de empresários coloniais abastados, relacionados e ligados ao fortuoso comércio de escravos no final do século XVIII, com fortes ligações com os comerciantes da cidade do Cabo. As ligações estreitas de Dona Josefa com a estrutura política colonial da época em Moçambique tornaram-se evidentes num documento que remete a sua oferta de escravos para a coroa portuguesa, então estabelecida no Rio de Janeiro, no Brasil. Pode estar relacionado com isso o facto de que, ao mesmo tempo, o São José Paquete da África, pertencente a Manuel Pereira, zarpar da ilha de Moçambique para as Américas com uma carga de 500 escravos. Um documento do Arquivo Histórico de Lisboa mostra que alguns destes escravos estavam isentos de taxas aduaneiras, uma condição que aponta para o facto de que poderiam estar destinados à coroa portuguesa então instalada no Brasil. O São José Paquete da África não conseguiu concluir a sua viagem para a América, naufragando na cidade do Cabo. Dos 500 escravos, 300 morreram e os restantes terminaram as suas vidas como muitos mais escravos que interromperam sua viagem nesta cidade sul-africana. Podem ser alguns desses escravos os oferecidos à coroa portuguesa por Dona Josefa? Como muitos outros escravos não sabemos. Mas o facto é que, como muitos outros escravos do Vale do Zambeze, Eles fizeram uma longa e dolorosa viagem desde a Aringa de Tundo, cerca de 700 quilómetros para o interior, longe da costa, na foz do rio Zambeze. Iniciaram a sua viagem provavelmente em Lúzios, embarcação tradicional fluvial da região hoje extinta, ao longo do Grande Rio, e depois para o norte, ao longo da costa em Pangaios, praia de Moçambique, onde embarcaram no São José de volta para sul, até terminar tragicamente a sua viagem na cidade do Cabo. Pronto, isto são somente algumas hipóteses que colocamos à volta desta interessante descoberta desta aringa. Não há uma comprovação efetiva que saíram dali os escravos para o São José. Existem hipóteses de estudo, de investigação, mas certamente existe esta ligação dos escravos que circulavam centenas e centenas de quilómetros ao longo do Grande Rio, do interior para a costa, e penso que temos aqui a reconstituição das rotas do interior, baseadas em alguma documentação fidedigna, pois a rota, esses estudos de rotas e, portanto, observações sobre rotas de escravos eram muito pouco fundamentadas e, portanto, temos aqui o início de um trabalho mais sério que mostra os trajetos que faziam, os longos percursos, os meios de transporte utilizados e tudo isso. E eu penso que é um aspecto muito interessante a considerar em futuras investigações. E muitíssimo obrigado e desculpem lá, mas realmente estávamos a apresentar e de repente a internet caiu e ficámos assim suspensos.
Coxucuro, muito obrigado.
Obrigada. Passamos então agora para a apresentação do Reinaldo. Reinaldo tem aqui os seus slides. Vou então fazer o share screen. Assim seja isto.
Bem, boa tarde a todos aí, boa tarde a vocês, né, que estão do outro lado aí, aqui ainda é começo da manhã, ainda está no final da manhã na realidade, e eu vou falar um pouco do que aconteceu aqui na realidade, novamente fazer um papel que anteriormente eu fiz na minha apresentação lá em Cape Town, apresentar um pouco o Maranhão, né, para a gente entender onde é que o paquete São José ele iria, certo? Então, é um pouco disso que eu vou acabar apresentando aqui, bem como parte do resultado da pesquisa que nós fizemos aqui estes últimos anos, certo? Um compêndio grande, na realidade, de material documental, que especificamente nós fizemos aqui na Universidade Estadual do Maranhão e do Piauí, e relacionado ao meu núcleo de estudos, certo? Com quem eu trabalho aqui já com um conjunto de outros professores. Pois bem, que basicamente ficou essa intitulada, né, Histórias Inacabadas do Destino Não Atingido do Paquete São José, né, aqui. E aí eu vou iniciar agora aqui a apresentação. Se puderes passar, por favor, para poder seguir aqui. Pois bem, então o núcleo ele é o NEAfrica, que é o Núcleo de Ensino, Pesquisa e Extensão sobre a África e o Sul Global. Nós, a partir de 2010, começamos a montar uma longa, extensa, na realidade, de material documental que poderia ser interessante. Dentre esses, na interlocução com o 𝐻𝐴𝐧𝐿, nós atentamos aí para um material mais documental sobre o tráfico de escravos de diferentes regiões de África, certo? Passa, por favor, Rosa, por gentileza, obrigado. E especificamente aqui o Maranhão, né? O Maranhão é essa localidade que está em vermelho aí do Brasil, ela é próxima aqui à região da Amazônia. Nós temos uma particularidade com relação à vida escrava, um envolvimento indígena muito grande, e nós nos destacamos de 2010 para cá, inclusive na relação com o 𝐻𝐴𝐧𝐿, em tentar entender um pouco mais as peculiaridades do trabalho escravo, certo? E, sobretudo, tentando identificar e chamar as etnias africanas, né? As nações, portanto, da onde os escravos provinham do território africano, né? E aí viriam aos gêneros étnicos como Angola, Angola, Guiné ou ainda Moçambique, que é o caso aqui especificamente desta pesquisa, certo? E aí o resultado que vem um pouco mais para frente, por gentileza, Rosa, poderia passar? que vão existir diferentes rotas, né? E essa pesquisa ela vai ali pegar um longo espaço temporal, que é o espaço temporal de 1760 até 1835, em que nós tentamos encontrar os moçambicanos que estavam presentes aqui na região do Maranhão, aqui na região do Amazonas, especificamente do Maranhão, tá? E aí nós teríamos diferentes rotas, uma rota que sairia na região ali de Senegal, de Gâmbia, que seria uma mais direta com quem nós mantivemos um longo acordo de tráfico de escravos. Teríamos também uma outra rota provinda ali de Angola e de Minas. E, por fim, uma região mais do outro lado, mas muito espaço mesmo, ocasionalmente sendo feito, que é a que vem da região, provinda ali da região de Moçambique especificamente. Essas seriam as 3 rotas que acabariam desaguando aqui com trabalhadores africanos, já no período ali do final do século XVIII, começo do século XIX, nesse período de 1760 até 1835. Por gentileza, Rosa, por gentileza. E aí, esse território do Maranhão, e eles vão ficar, esses escravos africanos, sobretudo os moçambicanos, nesse espaço territorial que nós conseguimos localizar aqui com a pesquisa, que é no centro do Maranhão, num rio chamado Itapecuru, pegando cidades e freguesias importantes que vão abastecer e está vinculado aqui à região colonial, certo? E vão, na realidade, ajudar com a construção aqui da capitania do Maranhão no final do século XVIII, certo? Então, toda essa região que está aí mais destacada em cor era onde estavam localizados os moçambicanos esparsos, né, de uma maneira espacialmente localizadas aqui no Itapecuru, propriamente dito, que nós conseguimos localizar, certo? Que números são esses, né, que eu acho que, na realidade, a gente vai parar para ponderar e o que que acontece. Vamos aos fatos, né? Paquete São José naufragou, vinha para cá, não chegou, né? A primeira realidade é essa, mas a segunda ela é interessante, né? Porque em 20 de abril de 1797, nós encontramos no arquivo digital, né, no arquivo do Histórico Ultramarino, o navio Navegantes, né, que traz aí o capitão José Joaquim Pereira, né, provavelmente um parente aí de Antônio Pereira e do Manuel João Antônio Pereira, certo? Esse navio, especificamente, não a documentação não descreve exatamente que navio é esse, mas ele tem 371 escravos moçambicanos. Ele vem para cá em 1797, né? 20 de abril de 1797, e aqui ele vai ficar durante 4 meses. Portanto, ali por volta de agosto, ele vai zarpar. Mas quando ele sai de Moçambique, em 1797, feito por esse provável parente aí do Manuel Pereira, do Antônio Pereira, certo? Que tem uma relação provável aí com o Paquete São José, ele vai trazer o antigo governador de Moçambique, que é o Dom Diogo de Souza, né? Ele sai com o governador de lá em 1797, e a partir de 1700, do final de 97, começo de 98, esse capitão, antigo governador de Moçambique, vira agora governador do Maranhão, até 1804. É nesse período, mais ou menos, entre 1798 e 1804, que a gente vai ter algumas entradas de africanos. Entretanto, a gente não tem controle desses volumes, né? O material documental não ajuda a ter um controle desse volume propriamente dito. O fato é que essa embarcação, especificamente, ela vai zarpar para Lisboa em agosto de 97, e ela vai levar para Lisboa arroz e algodão, certo? Que é um elemento interessante porque não vai servir somente para o tráfico de escravos, mas também para o próprio movimentação, na realidade, dos materiais que iriam escoar, por conta de uma lei decretada na capitania, certo? Que todo material que saísse daqui, ele deveria, na realidade, levar arroz e algodão com destino a Lisboa, né? Então, esse é o cenário especificamente relacionado à família Pereira, né? Aparentemente, os Pereira também vão ter uma relação com o Pará, né? Uma amiga aqui minha, a Marley Silva, ela inclusive está fazendo um levantamento documental aí bem interessante sobre a família Pereira para o Pará, mas parece que, na realidade, os Pereira já têm uma relação com Angola, já faziam o tráfico de escravos para o Pará, que é nosso vizinho aqui do Maranhão, que também trabalha com a Amazônia especificamente, certo? E assim começamos com os navegantes. Então, você tem uma entrada de africanos? Tem uma entrada de africanos aqui, especificamente, dentro da região norte do Brasil. Né? Por gentileza, Rosa. E aí, como seria mais ou menos essa lógica? O que aconteceria? A probabilidade é que o número realmente é muito pequeno. Não passaria de 2% de moçambicanos que entram nesse período. Um número irrisório. Certo? Ao que parece, a Companhia de Comércio do Grão-Pará e Maranhão, bem como o contrato de Cachel que vai seguir a companhia, tanto a companhia quanto o contrato mantinham uma relação com a África Ocidental, mas eles vão fechar em 1797. Certo? Na realidade, a companhia ela fecha na década de 70, o contrato vai continuar até 97. Bem, como na realidade não vai ter mais nenhuma companhia, nenhum contrato, a família Pereira ela vai aproveitar a brecha. Ela vai tentar, na realidade, articular uma nova rota, uma rota com Angola e uma rota com Moçambique. Certo? Que aí vão ser essas duas tentativas. A do paquete São José, que vai naufragar, certo? E a dos navegantes, certo? Que vai tentar ainda trazer alguns escravos moçambicanos. E isso provavelmente até 1804, mas eu admito que, na realidade, os números são bem pequenos mesmo, que nós encontramos aqui na documentação. Certo? O fato é isso, é esse o cenário, certo? De números bem específicos de uma família que tenta, na realidade, aproveitar uma brecha no comércio do tráfico de escravos, certo? Para a região ali do norte da América Portuguesa, do norte do Brasil especificamente. Por gentileza, Rosa. E aí, o que nós trabalhamos aqui, gente? Nós trabalhamos com um material muito específico, enorme, na realidade, são imensos compêndios documentais, que são os inventários feitos aqui no Tribunal de Justiça, na Relação de Justiça do Norte da América Portuguesa. Esses documentos, eles variam entre 50 folhas, né, aí frente e verso, dando, portanto, mais de 100 páginas, até alguns casos muito específicos de 632 folhas, portanto, mais de 1.200, né? Mais de 1.200 páginas especificamente. No meio desse material documental, nós encontramos os escravos, e aí nós conseguimos localizar e chamar as etnias e nações. Né? Os inventários, dentro desses 445 que nós encontramos moçambicanos, foram somente 72. Certo? 72 inventários com moçambicanos. Os escravos como um todo que nós coletamos foram 9.700 escravos coletados, certo? Identificando as suas etnias, identificando as suas nações. Entretanto, infelizmente, só localizamos 173 moçambicanos. Mas isso corrobora também com a lógica de que era uma rota difícil, era uma rota muito longa, extensa, e que era um risco de uma família específica, que era dos Pereira, que estava tentando incrementar, junto ao governador da capitania, um tráfico de escravos para o Maranhão. Certo? Assim, portanto, os números flutuam de moçambicanos aqui entre 1% e 2% na região. É uma rota pouca, né? Uma rota bem fraca no que diz respeito ao número e volume do tráfico de escravos especificamente. Por gentileza, Rosa. E aqui temos um exemplo, que é o inventário. Aí está aparecendo meio trocado, deveria estar de uma outra lógica, ele está invertido aqui, né? Mas esse aqui é o inventário da Joana Maria Freire, que tem 77 escravizados, e esse aqui é o que mais tem moçambicanos, são 11 ao todo. Infelizmente está aí deitado, mas o primeiro seria o João Moçambique, que ele teria entre 20 e poucos anos. O segundo é o Sebastião Moçambique, certo? O terceiro, se eu não me engano, é a Joana, agora que eu estou buscando de cabeça, certo? Moçambique. Mas, em sua grande maioria, na realidade, são homens. Nessa faixa, nós consideramos como faixa produtiva do tráfico de escravos, certo? Ali entre 15 e 30 anos de idade. Certo? Seria mais ou menos isso. Em sua grande maioria, os moçambicanos que nós temos aqui, dentro da capitania do Maranhão, norte do Brasil. certo? Na região amazônica. Por gentileza, Rosa. E aí, somente para a gente ter uma ideia, está aqui mais ou menos os nomes de alguns outros, né? A idade deles e os valores, que seriam valores, na realidade, atribuídos a esses escravos, certo? Flutuando ali entre 100 mil réis e 200 mil réis, dependendo da especificidade dele, da idade, do gênero, e assim por diante. Apenas um quadro demonstrativo que eu queria, na realidade, espelhar aqui para vocês, certo? Para vocês terem uma ideia. E, por fim, né? Aí, por gentileza, Rosa, eu consegui localizar algumas localidades onde estão esses moçambicanos. No caso, é o sítio Boroti, o sítio Pindóia, Paragem Santa Isabel, Fazenda Boa Vista, Fazenda Boa Esperança, Fazenda Conceição, Fazenda Timbotiba. Essas localidades eram antigas fazendas de produção tanto de arroz quanto de algodão, aqui na ribeira do Itapecuru, que é aquela localidade que eu mostrei para vocês mais especificamente, né, lá no começo da minha fala. E aí, eu consegui localizar mais ou menos essas regiões, né? Inclusive, eu fiz algumas incursões, até 2 ou 3, mas infelizmente não tem nenhuma memória que a gente possa colocar uma memória mais oral, né? Não consegui acesso a uma dessas fazendas, que é a de Santa Isabel, certo? Infelizmente, ainda não conseguiu, aí veio a Covid, o negócio realmente complicou para eu ir até a Santa Isabel para fazer uma averiguação, certo? Mas me disseram que lá na Fazenda Santa Isabel existe, sim, uma leve memória, se fala de algumas coisas, e assim por diante. Infelizmente, eu não sei ainda como é que é isso a nível concreto. Tenho que fazer uma visita lá especificamente, certo? E fechando aqui a coisa como um todo, por gentileza, Rosa. Ou seja, esse seria realmente um empreendimento inacabado? Houve um incremento aí da família Pereira para tentar chegar num acordo aí com o governador-geral, que acabou ocupando o cargo aqui no Maranhão especificamente, que vai trazer algumas embarcações, vai trazer alguns moçambicanos até a região, e aí nós tentamos localizar algumas coisas. É realmente um empreendimento inacabado? Seguiu para algumas coisas. Os fatos concretos é que os números de presença moçambicana são realmente muito baixos, tá? Mas não impede que exista, né, ou haja, né, alguma resquício de participação deles. Isso é algo que eu ainda pretendo investigar mais a fundo para ver se pelo menos numa das fazendas existe algum resquício de memória. Mas isso foi o que nós chegamos nesses últimos anos aqui de pesquisa do quadro documental, certo? Era basicamente isso. Peço desculpas pela demora, certo? Muito obrigado.
Okay, now we have Paul Gardulho. Stop sharing. Paul?
Ok. Boa tarde a todos. É meu prazer estar com vocês hoje. O meu nome é Paul, sou dos Estados Unidos. Eu vou falar em inglês, desculpe. It's very good to see many of my friends from around the world at this presentation and to meet new friends. My name is Paul Gardulho. I am a curator at the National Museum of African American History and Culture at the Smithsonian. And I'm going to want to talk a little bit today about the big picture on this project. And I think thinking about the role of museums, what do museums have to do? What can museums do? What should museums do when faced with this history and its continuing resonance today and its continuing importance today? I'm going to share my screen. Please bear with me. Okay. So I think we've heard a lot in the past several presentations about the depth of research involved in the search for and around a single ship, the broader world of enslavement and slave trading that existed in the 18th and 19th centuries, the ways in which the worlds were connected and can be sort of reclaimed through the archive. But I also want to talk about the roles that museums can play in all in this broader efforts, not just in sort of diving back into the archive, whether that is the archive on paper in places like Archivo Nacional or archive of material culture, that remains unwritten and in too many ways untapped. But I also want to think about not just the notion of diving into and reframing the archive, but the role of museums in expanding that archive. Thinking about knowledge production as something that is a place for collaboration, for truth-telling, and for reclamation. And I think we've heard a lot of the potential for that now. And with that in mind, I want to talk a little bit about the role of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in this global effort for truth-telling, for reconciliation, and for expanding the archive. And certainly through the 𝐧𝐼𝐻 project, as you saw from your overview with Dr. Lubkeman, the museum can potentially and productively see itself not just as a showcase for artifacts, although certainly museums do have not just a valuable, but a vital role in presenting histories to people and bringing people from all backgrounds face to face with authentic artifacts that help inspire them, that sometimes help them face hard truths, that are places that expand their minds, but also expand the capacity of their hearts and emotions to not just connect to the past, but to connect to our own present. And with that in mind, we see the work at the National Museum of African American History and Culture with the 𝐧𝐼𝐻 project as an essential part of that work. Work is not just about diving into the archive to reclaim histories, but it's also about bringing communities into that archive, not just to learn histories that have been hidden, but also to look at those histories with new eyes, to find new information that hasn't been seen before, due to the questions that were being asked, due to the backgrounds of people who were looking. And I think that's a vital sort of need that we have to address. We have to think about the kinds of ways that archives have been built historically, and that we need to figure out ways to navigate them in our contemporary world. Now, of course, that means storytelling, and what you're here seeing is a few pictures of our work in the 𝐧𝐼𝐻 project that helps us understand that the museum is vitally connected to the world. And I think you got a sense of that a little bit from Jaco's speech as well, that the work is not just happening in the museums proper, but it is happening in conservation labs. Up on the top left, we have a young woman named Aisha, who is from Senegal, who is doing work on the materials, on the ballast from the São José. In the middle center, we have one of our colleagues, Jay Hagler, from our partnership Diving with a Purpose, who is training people on Mozambique Island to become community monitors, community stewards of the underwater heritage, to work directly with people like Yolanda and Ricardo. And to give you I just wanted to pick two of those images to give you a picture of the ways in which this work is vibrant, living, and deeply connected to today. Of course, We also are telling stories in museums proper. As you learned from Jaco's presentation, 𝐂𝐧𝐼𝐻 has moved forward and crafted an exhibition around the story of the São José, the history of the São José in the late 18th century, but also its continuing resonance today for people in Cape Town, people who are visiting in the slave lodge, a likely spot where survivors of the São José were brought after they were rescued from the shipwreck, only later to be sold into slavery in South Africa. And so this is some images of my own museum's presentation of the story of the São José in a larger context of the Middle Passage, of the global slave trade. And the way we choose to do that is a variety of techniques. One is we crafted a space in the museum to house the artifacts that are on loan from South Africa. That is primarily a space of meditation and emotional resonance. It's almost like a memorial. But we have so much more to learn from this history than how we feel about it. And so we needed to craft another space in the museum to get at the story of how we know what we know about this history, the detective work that goes on in the archives, under the waves, and within communities on trying to find out information from diagnostic information about the ship to archives related to the Pereiras, to seeing if we might be able to track down descendant communities. And there is of survivors from that history. There's no one tool that is sufficient to tell this story, right? As we learned early on, the tools are multiple, and the tools should be sort of always reaching toward a wider understanding and deeper connections between us all in this history, I would argue. And so I want to provide for you a little look into one of our newer tools that is helping to tell this story, and that is online. Due to the global pandemic, we realized that while millions of visitors have still come to the museum in Washington, D.C., we needed to create more expansive platforms to begin to tell this story online. And so one of our efforts has been to craft a story map or a website that goes into the many journeys of the São José as a global history, from our shared past that is waiting to be recovered in our shared present. I'm going to take you to one of these, and I want to walk through a bit of the story map with you all and end with a few questions before I hand the mic over to the next speaker. But I think what I want to help us think about and meditate on is the way in which the São José is not just a story of the past, but it is very much a story of reckoning in our present. It's a story where we each can take responsibility. I think we talked a little bit in the beginning about for individuals taking responsibility. I would argue it's also an opportunity for institutions to take responsibility for telling this story, for nations to take responsibility. So let me see if I can link over to the story map itself. And what you see here is the platform for which we can explore the global history of this story in a series of maps. And the way we've chosen to tell this story is in a series of journeys. The great benefit is that we have tremendous video and audio and research that has been compiled by all of the members of the project that goes in and helps to create such a vibrant platform for understanding this story. But what I want to bring us to is this sense of a journey, because what we wish to help people to understand is the journey of the São José is not just one, but it is made up of several different journeys. The 18th century journey, the historical journey of the São José, was one of exploitation, subjugation, and slavery. But our journey today as a group known as the �𝐴 Project, with partners from Brazil to Mozambique to the United States, and maybe someday within Portugal, is dedicated to remembering that history, as well as sort of understanding that our journey can be one of reckoning and repair and cooperation and perhaps justice. And so within this story map, we trace a historical journey of the São José. I'm sorry, I can't. We also trace a journey that is of justice and of detective work. I just need to minimize our screen so I can't see you on the side anymore, so I can navigate here. We trace a discovery journey that gets into the science of the work and the continuing science of the work. We trace personal journeys, but we also trace a journey of heritage and justice, and thinking about what this means for us today, not just in our own personal spheres, but on a global sphere. And so with this in mind, I just want to walk you through this one element of the story map, because I think it frames some essential questions for our later discussion. We're a little slow, but what I will suggest is that you please could someone drop the link to the story map in our chat today? And I encourage you all to kind of spend some time. There's a lot of information there, some of which you heard in the presentations today. But let me take us on it's a restatement and an encapsulation of some of what you've already heard from colleagues on our symposium today. But I think what's important for us to remember is this sense of the search for the São José, that what it reveals to us about ourselves and our current world. What started on the site of a shipwreck in Cape Town has connected us to Mozambique, Brazil, Portugal, the Netherlands, and the United States. And so this work that we're at has been ongoing for well over 10 years, but in some ways we're still at the beginnings of it. And I want to take you on a global tour of where we've been, some of which you've heard of before, but it's important to just remember. The work that is taking place that you learned about from Ricardo and Yolanda is ongoing in Mozambique, on Ilha, and also with communities in Moçaril, where we were able to work with communities to conduct a memorial ceremony. And I think we may hear a little bit more about that from my colleague Kamal Siddiqui and his participation in this memorial journey of returning soil to the site of the São José. But the work, as you learned, is also taking place not just with communities, but on Ilha, in two ways to preserve the broader underwater heritage around Mozambique Island, to continue to search for other evidence of the slave trade and enslavement, also to recover memories of people and to help to train local people to protect their heritage, to recognize it, to protect it, and to find ways that they might begin to sort of build cultural tourism around this history. We learned a little bit about how the wreck site in Clifton in Cape Town is now a site of national heritage recognized by the South African government. And the work that is ongoing in the Slave Lodge is one that connects that living site, that perpetually changing site, to a space of conservation and preservation and memory, a place where we're transforming a story from human wrongs into human rights. And so the Slave Lodge, which had been a site of oppression and slavery and confinement, is now a space where people are actively working to find descendant communities who are researching and finding more about this, how this particular wreck gives us a worldview into the late 18th century. Our own museum is displaying these pieces from the São José in a large exhibition called Slavery and Freedom. And I think what's really important for American audiences is for the millions of people who come to Washington, D.C., who expect to see a story about slavery that may be relegated to something like the 19th century American South, coming and are faced with a much bigger history, a history that reaches far back beyond 1776, beyond 1619, into the 1400s. And they also see an expansive story that reaches to South Africa and Mozambique, and helps us all to understand as Americans how this story is connected to us as well. That the story of slavery is a story of making of the modern world. It is not just a story of one nation. It's a story of many peoples and many nations. And it's a story that needs to be told through the lens of and the viewpoints of those who were enslaved, so that we understand that while telling stories of systems of domination are crucial, just as crucial are the stories of survival and keeping oneself whole despite those systems of brutality and domination. We learned from Reinaldo that this story touches and reaches into Brazil. And while the story of the ship, the São José, never made it to Maranhão, the owners certainly did. And that their work was a world that connected South America, North America. And we're just, I'm amazed by the amount of research that is coming out that we just learned from Reinaldo, which was some of which was new to me, and I was struggling to keep up because my Portuguese is not so great. The story definitely touches Portugal, and we have much work to do here. I think that thinking about the way in which a single shipwreck, the story of a single ship, of a family who are trading in other human beings and also trading in other commodities through the period of the 17 and 1800s is vital. It's crucial for us to understand, and we cannot ignore it anymore. We have to be thinking about the ways that this story is told in Portugal as well. And finally, we tell the story in the Netherlands. And I think the Netherlands is vital, not just as an archival resource, but understanding the role that the Netherlands played also within the slave trade. The Netherlands has a deep history and connection, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, within Brazil. I think we need to begin to think more carefully and complexly about the connections between all of our stories and the ways that they touch us all historically and today, and we all have a bit of responsibility in telling them. Let me come back to the story map, away from the story map, and end with a couple questions. my questions to you today, and perhaps we can bring them up in our discussion later, is in the 𝐓𝐺𝐻 project, we always want to have people think about who this history belongs to, who is responsible for bringing it back into memory, and how will you choose to remember it? And to put that more bluntly, I guess I might say, what are we going to do about it? What is our job and our responsibility in remembering this past, but also making sure that remembering this past helps lead us to a better future? So thank you very much.
Paul, can you stop sharing your screen?
Yes.
We'll have
There you go.
Kamal next. You ready, Kamal?
Yes, I'm ready. Boa noite. That's about the extent of my Portuguese, unfortunately. But I'm really pleased and humbled, actually, to be a part of this presentation. So I thank all of the people who put it together, Raquel, Steve, 𝐓𝐺𝐻 Project, folks at the museum. So thank you, and thank you for inviting me to share a few thoughts. My name is Kamal Siddiqui, and I'm a lead instructor and board member of an organization called Diving with a Purpose. So I'll just jump right into my thoughts. I'll be somewhat brief. I know time is getting a bit long, but hopefully we can have some fruitful dialogue and discussions after these presentations. So what I'm gonna try to do this morning is talk just briefly about Diving with a Purpose, our organization, and I think it's important that we focus and centralize our discussion on the one artifact that is central to all this discussion, that is the slave ship and what it means. Just some brief highlights on what we know about the existing slave ships, and then more importantly, what it means by memory and remembrance, and getting beyond the silence and the shame, and talk briefly about my São José Paquete Africa experience. And I'm going to wrap it up with this idea of how do these artifacts speak to us and speak through us to bring this narrative forward about the trade. So Diving with a Purpose, DWP as we say, it's a nonprofit organization here in the States that teaches certified divers how to document and survey shipwrecks. And our primary focus is on ships that participated in the transoceanic slave trade, we call them. We teach the techniques of underwater archaeology principles and the basics of that in an immersion course each year. I'll be going down to Florida here in a week or so to teach that class down in the Florida Keys. We have about 30 students, so we're excited about that. This will be our first class post, I shouldn't say post-COVID, but our first class after about a 2 to 3 year hiatus. And if you want to learn more about us, I'm sure most of you are aware that we were highlighted in the March 2022 issue of the Nat Geo magazine, along with a great podcast called Into the Depth. So you can Google Into the Depth and find out a little bit more about Diving with a Purpose. So I also want to frame my presentation around a few questions. Can you imagine what it would be like to live without memory of who you are, where you came from, your history, your culture? And the sort of the African life ways or cosmology, it's critically important to be connected to ancestors. And when you are disconnected from those ancestors, it's like you're not a whole person. You know, you got this tremendous hole in your soul, if you will. So it's important to the humanity of who you are to be connected. But if you don't have no memory of that connection, it becomes a tremendous challenge. So that memory connects us to our history and our ancestors. Excuse me. And as I said, if you're disconnected from those ancestors and memory, how does it affect your identity, who you are within this human family on this little small blue dot floating through the universe? But more importantly and critical for me is that how did it become even possible for nations founded on the democratic principle of freedom and justice for all to allow over 350 years of chattel slavery and bondage for more than 12 million human beings? How in the shaping of so-called Western civilization has a global system of brutal bondage and oppression existed for centuries and not be deeply embedded in our collective memory? What happened? How did we get here? And why it's such a struggle to get those narratives and stories back into our memory? So this question of amnesia and collective memory is central to, I think, our dialogue and discussions. That's been a suppression of memory for two main reasons. I think that suppression of memory is because of, from the victim side, because of the tremendous, the tremendous pain. Don't want to recall that sort of experience. But more importantly, on the other side, is that suppression of memory has been very systemic due to racism and system of white supremacy. That's been the creation of deception, so that victims won't remember. But I think it's important for us to remember, because remembering is empowering. Remembering is empowering, and it restores our sense of humanity, and more importantly, it avoids the repetition or the repeating of such tragedy, such crime against humanity that the transoceanic, transatlantic slave trade represents. So this work of memory restoration is critical. And we do that, it's done in several different ways, through cultural heritage and the objects that's embedded in culture. But collective memory is a part of our community. It's an important source of our history. Particularly identifying who we are and where we fit in this global human family. But more importantly, we look a lot at artifacts to try to frame that memory. But that's the material side of things. But I think it's critically important that we pay attention to the immaterial as well, because there's a lot of information and data that can be add to the narrative of memory restoration. That's the immaterial. And I'll talk a bit about that a little later. So the slave ship and collective memory, and how do we get beyond the silence and the shame? I'm sure most of you all are familiar with Marcus Rediker, and he framed it very, very eloquently, I think, in this quote from his book, The Slave Ship, Human History, how pivotal the slave ship was in establishing Western civilization, the whole system of capitalism. I won't read it here, it's a bit long, but I just offer it as a reference here, because it was pivotal in transforming the world, and we are all living in the world today as a result of the slave ship. And we have to embrace that and again understand the pivotal role that it played in that narrative. And from a Portugal perspective, this information is from the slave voyages database, and the disembarkation of captive Africans in the Western civilization was primarily from Portuguese vessels. Nearly half of all of Africans that disembarked in Western civilization, South and North America, Caribbean, came from Portuguese vessels. But again, the memorialization of these events, as I understand it, in Portuguese itself, is very little known. So the suppression of memory has been very systemic, and once we understand, the process of how this deception and systemic suppression of our memory has happened, I think we can have a more productive and engaging conversation about the restoration of that memory. So I think Steve might have alluded to it earlier. The sheer volume of this activity over the centuries of the trade involved some 12,000 plus vessels that we know of that forcibly transported Africans across the oceans to the Americas and the Caribbean. Those 12,000 vessels or so was involved in 40,000 plus voyages. And as we can tell from the record, there was about 1,000 plus wrecking events. And from those wrecking events, 1,000 plus wrecking events, we know roughly about 15 of them. Why haven't particularly the archaeological community that's been primarily dominated by the colonists, engaged this tremendously rich, at least from our perspective, cultural material, and begin to tell the story and restoring these memories. So in these voyages involved, as you know, most of academics say about 12.4 million, but 12 to 15 million. We have to add a what I call a fudge factor, if you will. You know, sometimes you see numbers up to 25 million. I think Philip Curtin projects something like 25 million human beings that was involved in the trade. And in any regard, it was the largest forced migration of human beings in human history. And so it's important for us to sort of tell that story. And I just threw together a list that I was aware of from the historical record of the non-slave shipwrecks. These are the ones of the 12,000 plus vessels we know participated in the trade. We only know about relatively 15 or so. And of course, São José is one of those. And there's a listing of a few others here, including the Clotilda, that I will talk a bit about when I wrap up my presentation here. So this is the wrecking site of the São José. Steve and others have talked about this. That's the beach there, and that's Cherry Rock. That was how I think one of the obstacles that the São José slammed up against and began the sinking process here. As you can see, this is a very exclusive beach with high-level condos there. And for over 200 years, this wreck lay right before the face of this exclusivity, if you will, and out of memory, out of sight, out of mind. But through our work, we're bringing that back into discussions. Now, I've talked quite a bit about I've dove this site. I've talked quite a bit about my experiences in diving this site, which for me was very humbling and moving. You know, we have to do the science, and Slave Wrecks Project and 𝐂𝐚 has done some critical work in terms of engaging the material culture of this wreck and telling that story. But there's another dimension, at least for me, that we have to look at as well, and that's that immaterial sort of dimension that I talked about earlier. When I first dove this site, it's a very turbulent site. You can see the kelp on the surface there. This is a good day, actually. The surges is about 15 to 20 feet. You're moving back and forth. The kelp and the sand is being stirred up and so forth. In addition to all that, the temperature is about 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Very chilly. So the environment is really not conducive to, good diving. But in any event, when I dove this site initially, I remember thinking what it would be like for me, being a person of African descent, diving this site. I have the privilege and honor of diving at least 5 slave wreck sites, and the São José and the Clotilda has been the most profound on me. So when I first saw a part of this site, which was a wooden piece of member, it might have been part of the structure of the vessel, but we think it might have been some of the cargo on the vessel. But in any event, I just remember reaching out and grabbing that particular artifact. And what reverberated in my soul and my body, it was tremendous. I could hear this pain and the suffering of those people trying to struggle for their lives during this wrecking event. And it affected me profoundly. And so I wanted to make sure that we stay engaged to help tell this story. And we can talk a bit about that more later. Every time I talk about it, I get a bit emotional, but it's an important part of the story. So what I want to kind of really highlight here is when I dove that site, I was buddied with another colleague from South Africa. She's a National Geographic Explorer now. And we were dredging the site. And I won't go into a lot of detail here on this particular story, but it's important. She's very playful, Kenny. And she I was handling the dredge, and she tapped me on the shoulder and said, come out. She didn't speak that, but she underwater directed me over to another site because she had saw something glimmering in the water. It was an albacore shell that was glimmering off some of the sunlight underwater. And so I went over there and started dredging, and this is what I uncovered. Long story short here is what eventually was a shackle from that site. And those shackles were curated by the museum, and some of this material is in the 𝐂𝐧𝐞 and the National Museum of African American History and Culture. But more importantly, Diving with the Purpose thinks that as we work on these sites, that these are profoundly sacred sites, that people who were mothers, fathers, craftspeople, uncles, children, griots, priests, were on these vessels, and they lost their lives here. In the case of the São José, there was 212 individuals that lost their lives, and an additional 200 or so that suffered tremendously and eventually end up in the institution of slavery. But as we engage these artifacts, like these shackles, like these wrecks themselves, there are voices in these artifacts that we have to listen to, that are speaking to us through us to tell this story. And it's profoundly important that we are able to listen, not necessarily listen with our ears, but listen with our hands as archaeologists and so forth, as we interrogate these artifacts. We have to listen sort of with our hands with what these artifacts are telling us. And I'll end my presentation with this. This is a sonar image of the Clotilda. I just completed a 10-day mission in the Mobile River in the state of Alabama here in the U.S. And this is the only vessel that participated in the trade where we have about 80% of the structure of the vessel still remaining. Nowhere in the historical record is this. Not only that, there's a very powerful descendant community that's associated with this vessel in the area as well. I was able to dive this vessel for the first time and actually go into the hold of the vessel where 110 captive Africans was held for over 2.5 months. This is no bigger than your living room. Some living rooms are even smaller. And so for 2.5 months, these Africans were captured in this hole. And when I knew I was going to go into that hole, and so I knew it would be a sort of profound moment for me. I'm sorry, but I had to I wanted to memorialize this moment because this is historic. As I mentioned, this is the only, you can see the outline of the vessel here and the actual hole where these Africans was held. We don't have an artifact like that anywhere else in the world. And so I felt somewhat privileged to enter into that space. And a friend of mine, a dear friend, Sabrina Johnson, I think she might be in this session, we crafted what we're calling an ancestral prayer for me entering into this hole and honoring these ancestors. And if I can read it just real quickly, and then I'll wrap up. This ancestral prayer is called Reviving the Spirits Who Traveled on the Clotilda. Beloved ancestors, your voices have been quiet for 162 years, but your silence ends now. Your voices and memory are lifted now from this wretched vessel, lifted through us, and we welcome you to speak through us. Our connection will never be broken. We are because you are. Thank you for reaching out to us. Blessings to you and your spirits always. So that's what I took into that hole. And I'll finish with this. It's something that's dear to my heart. That's an academic in Australia, excuse me, that talks about the spiritual dimensions in material culture and conservation as we do this work. And we have to pay attention to these artifacts and what they're telling us. And he said, naturally prescriptive processes do not quite work when managing the intangible. But unless such issues are addressed, there will be a continuing disconnect between the best outcomes for collections and for the traditional owners of cultural information. Once sensitized to capturing and working with intangible elements, museum professionals, archaeologists, and others can be transformed into a new realm of understanding. And I think if we really want to deepen our understanding, we have to listen to the voices of these artifacts, what they're telling us. Thank you very much. I'll conclude it with that.
Thank you, Kamal. Well, I will finish this panel with my own presentation, and then when I finish, I'll pass the command of the whole thing to Paulo. So let me just share the screen. Okay, so this presentation is based on archival research developed by the SlaveWrecks Project and Chapas, an association dedicated to the investigation, collection, and curation of the history of insurance in Portugal. The São José was just one of the many ships owned by José António Pereira, and its wrecking opened the door to wider research into the Portuguese slave trade through the lens of this long-forgotten slave traders' enterprise. José António Pereira was a very wealthy merchant from the city of Lisbon, who, like many other merchants, was involved in slave trading. His personal trajectory is very significant because, given its similarity regarding other important slave traders, it can shed light into some questions that remain understudied, at least in the Portuguese historiography. Namely, number one, the importance of slave trading in the building of individual fortunes. Two, how slave trading involved very complex networks of capital from various merchants, investors, authorities, and even the church across the entire globe, and how these networks operated throughout time. And three, the weight of slave trading in the Portuguese economy, and specifically its contribution in the development of the current financial and insurance systems. So Pereira started his career in the 1770s as a ship captain, quickly becoming a ship owner. His services to the Crown Company of Grão-Pará and Maranhão probably provided him with the necessary experience and the capital to start bigger enterprises. In the late 1780s, he was already a merchant, and like other merchants, his vessels were chartered by Portuguese authorities in the transportation of goods and enslaved people. We know, for instance, that the São José carried slaves that were to be delivered to the Portuguese crown, and that in other instances, his vessels transported military equipment for the Portuguese troops in Africa. Pereira traded slaves over more than 3 decades from the western and eastern coasts of Africa to several South American ports, and owned more than a dozen ships connecting Lisbon to the North Europe, namely the Netherlands, the Malabar and the Western Indian coasts, Mozambique, Cacheu, Bissau, Benguela, Luanda, São Tomé, Brazil, Montevideo, and Buenos Aires. Importantly, Pereira was among those private entrepreneurs who furnished funds, sought capital, provided freight, and made this whole system possible. Indeed, he had associates and business partners in all corners of the world, from Lisbon to Rio de la Plata, to Brazil, Luanda, north of Europe, and so on and so on. Pereira didn't just use the regular circuits of the slave trade. In many instances, he actively sought to expand the trade, either by requesting the crown for exemptions from the tight rules regulating the trade in the Asian ports, or by lobbying to create conditions to capture slaves in São Tomé. And this enterprise was only interrupted because of the French invasions. Otherwise, he would probably have been successful. In fact, Pereira was part of the first wave of crown-authorized slave traders bringing slaves from East Africa to Brazil, which was prohibited up to 1792. So the São José was perhaps the first legally authorized effort to bring slaves from Mozambique to Brazil. The records show that Pereira, among other wealthy Lisbon traders, had very close relationships with the Portuguese crown. He benefited from tax exemptions, for instance, the transportation of slaves to Pará, corresponded in friendly terms with many governors, and on many occasions successfully lobbied authorities in the defense of his commercial interests. In fact, the Portuguese crown was highly indebted to merchants like Pereira, since they were the main loaners to the crown in times of need. And these loans were then paid by granting traders with exclusive access to monopoly contracts like tobacco or soap or salt, and or with nobility statuses. In 1794, Pereira requested the crown to be granted the knighthood of the Order of Christ, the most distinctive title of status in the Portuguese Empire, based on his work as a slave trader, and quoting here, promoting the trade and the colonization of the Portuguese domains. And these words are of the Moçambique Baron, who who sponsored this request to the crown, and this request was indeed approved 1 year later. So he's granted the knighthood. The records also show that Pereira was extremely wealthy, and despite his dealings in many different goods, his main trade and basis for his fortune was indeed the commercialization of human lives. Besides owning more than a dozen vessels, and these are just some that we found so far, the several losses he suffered in his dealings, such as the São José and the 212 enslaved people on board, or 300 slaves he lost during an insurrection in 1796, or the ship Esperança, also lost during a slave insurrection. So all these losses did not prevent him from continuing his business, nor did they challenge his status. His profits could evidently sustain all these losses. In 1799, he started the construction of a building complex, including a palace, several storage buildings, and a private dock for his ships. This large estate is currently owned by the Lisbon municipality, but with the exception of the palace, which we see on the left, all the other buildings are vacant and abandoned. After more than 3 decades of activity, José António Pereira died in 1817 and was buried inside the Marianos convent. And this convent is on the same street of the palace. Now, interestingly, 67 years after his death in 1884, the Lisbon municipality decided to name the street connecting his estate after him. The plate with his name stands at both ends of the street, without any reference to who was José António Pereira or what was his main activity. In fact, Pereira is largely absent from historical records, with very few and recent exceptions. And when mentioned, he's described as a Lisbon merchant without any reference to slave trade. And you can see here in the map, the street signal in red, and these crosses are the estate, all the buildings that were owned by him. So what does the individual trajectory of this merchant tell us? Why are these biographical elements significant? Well, first of all, the complex network of other merchants, investors, loaners, church, and authorities around Pereira's activities demonstrate not just that slave trading was a global enterprise, expanding well beyond the traditional triangular commerce, but that it was also fully intermingled with and integrated into global trade writ large. Then, despite merchants like José António Pereira were involved in the trading of many different goods, like cotton and rice, like Reinaldo mentioned, slave trade was indeed their core business and the foundation for their wealth and social standing. Given the Crown's direct involvement in slave trading, and more importantly, its dependence towards the capital that merchants like Pereira could provide, the weight of slave trade in Portugal's national wealth needs to be fully investigated. Furthermore, given that some of the merchants and slave traders to whom José António Pereira was connected later specialize their activities towards funding, loaning, and insuring slave enterprises, rather than participating themselves as ship owners or freighters. So the question on whether and how slave trading shaped the Portuguese economy and financial system does require answers that are not currently available in the Portuguese historiography. So let me just wrap up with some final notes on the erasure of José António Pereira and his activities from history and public discourses. So if the characterization of Pereira as a merchant back in the 18th century reflected how enslaved humans were simply considered another form of merchandise like tobacco or ivory, and note, as Steve mentioned in the beginning, that in the account of the wreck given by the captain of the São José, he mentions that all people were saved, but not the cargo. Cargo referring to the 212 enslaved people who died in the event. So if back in the 18th century, the reference of José António Pereira as a merchant pointed to this fact at the time that enslaved people were just a commodity, currently, this designation is complicit in the erasure of the importance of the slave trade in the constitution of wealth and power in and throughout Portuguese society. Such erasure, complemented with the celebration of the long history of the country's maritime engagement, has precluded the reckoning of these simple facts. Three simple facts. Portugal was the nation most implicated in the Atlantic slave trade as a whole. Portugal was involved in it for almost 5 centuries. Portugal was instrumental in both the first and last chapters of slave trading, namely by enabling from the trade from the African eastern coast, which extended trading for another 60 to 70 years and brought more than 2 million additional enslaved people to the Americas. As such, our work at the SlaveWrecks Project of recovering the stories of the São José and its owner challenges social discourses suggesting that Portuguese society has less of a problem with racism, as well as the sanitized depictions of Portugal's involvement with slavery, which include false notions such as that the Portuguese were less violent than other Europeans in their relationships with the enslaved, or that Portugal led in global efforts to abolish slavery. Researching slave traders such as José António Pereira, unveiling the structure of his business, the nitty-gritty of his global enterprise, and the relationships he held with other traders, with authorities, with the crown, and the church, provides an illustrative deep dive that can demonstrate the broader social potential and importance of recovering forgotten facets of the past. Through this story, we are recovering a more complete Portuguese history, one that does not shy away from understanding the fullness of that history, including the Portuguese role in the transatlantic slave trade. That is all. Thank you.
Obrigado, Raquel. Bom, nós vamos continuar para a segunda parte. We are now, thank you all for staying with us. We are moving to the second part of our session. And before opening the debate, I would like to say a few words about the museum's work on the subject of slavery. Or in other words, I want to take this opportunity to show you a bit of what we do here at the Museum of Lisbon. For those who don't know our museum and what we have been working in the past few years. And I'm moving to Portuguese, unfortunately, and I'm sharing this with you. Bom, quero agradecer. This will only take a few minutes of your time, and I would like to first say thanks to the SlaveWrecks Project for considering the Museum of Lisbon as a partner, because it brings us another perspective of a theme that we are working for quite a few years. E tudo começou em 2017, porque em 2017 Lisboa foi a capital ibero-americana da cultura, e um dos projetos que ocorreu nessa altura foi o Testemunhos da Escravatura, a Memória Africana, um projeto que juntou 42 instituições e que permitiu destacar 200 objetos museológicos e documentais. Peço desculpa. Só o Museu de Lisboa contribuiu com algumas dezenas, e enfim, tivemos uma programação bastante alargada nesse ano de 2017, uma programação diversificada. Começámos com um pequeno projeto que foi destacar os testemunhos da escravatura na maquete de Lisboa anterior ao terremoto de 1755, e depois, durante praticamente todo esse ano, tivemos muitas atividades, incluindo algumas de conteúdo mais cultural, como a aquisição de uma peça chamada o Tony Malal, particularmente cultuada em África, e que o Museu de Lisboa adquiriu, e portanto foi possível fazer uma apresentação. Tivemos uma exposição, a primeira exposição que fizemos sobre o Corpus Christi, a exposição do Corpo de Deus, por Diamantino de Tujal, onde no século XVIII temos imensa informação acerca de confrarias de negros que participaram nessa exposição. Dedicámos também uma particular atenção a um escravo romano, o Notus, o escravo romano de um importante cidadão de Lisboa, de Olicipo, e que, portanto, também nos abre perspectivas para a maior globalidade e transtemporalidade que a escravatura representa, e que não pode só ser conotada com os séculos XV a XIX, mas que tem também uma história antes e depois de todo esse período. E ainda fizemos um ciclo de conferências sobre a permanência da presença africana na arte em Lisboa, sobretudo, de facto tem imenso potencial, e terminamos o ano com a apresentação da primeira edição dos Testemunhos da Escravatura, que continua a ser um livro importante para nós, e que estamos a ultimar uma segunda edição. Desde essa altura até hoje temos feito muitos projetos, sim, sem caráter exaustivo. Nós participámos na exposição Contar Áfricas de um dos nossos colegas do Padrão dos Descobrimentos, fizemos uma primeira visita à exposição do Palácio Pimenta, do Museu de Lisboa Palácio Pimenta, ainda com a versão antiga, e na Lisboa Plural, uma exposição que fizemos com a minha colega Ana Paula Antunes, e que foi uma exposição para nós muito importante, porque nos permitiu destacar um núcleo inteiramente dedicado à população africana que habitou Lisboa, sobretudo entre os séculos XV e XIX, e foi aí que apresentámos os números que foram também já hoje aqui identificados pelo Kamal Siddiqui, de que Portugal e o Brasil foram responsáveis pelo tráfico de praticamente 6 milhões de pessoas escravizadas de África para a América. Continuamos a trabalhar, sobretudo em visitas. Nós temos percursos dedicados ao tema da escravatura na cidade, e começámos com um primeiro percurso, agora temos 3, já fizemos 25 edições, e portanto esta é uma atividade que tem continuado de forma gradual no nosso museu, e ainda agora vamos inaugurar um terceiro percurso no dia 26 de junho sobre os lugares invisíveis da escravatura, neste caso dedicado à liberdade em Lisboa. Este é uma das fotografias do nosso segundo percurso, e aqui temos a travessa de José António Pereira, que a Raquel há pouco mencionava como sendo de facto um ilustre, desconhecido para os dias de hoje, e que houve de facto e nós acreditamos que houve essa deliberada intenção de esconder o facto de ele ter sido um negreiro, ou seja, que em Lisboa se chamava um negreiro, e que no fundo é um comerciante de escravos, pessoas escravizadas, e de facto houve essa intenção, e mesmo as notícias que nós temos sobre esta travessa no início do século XX omitem completamente esse passado obscuro do José António Pereira. E temos pontuado também esta atividade com a apresentação de alguns artigos mais específicos, alguns artigos de especialidade, como este que ainda vai sair agora na revista de museus, cujo lançamento será na próxima semana. Estamos a trabalhar também para o futuro em 3 grandes áreas. Uma delas é o desenvolvimento de uma app sobre os lugares da escravatura em Lisboa. Estamos a trabalhar já há mais de um ano e meio, mais ou menos, com parceiros tecnológicos. Temos dezenas e dezenas de pontos identificados, cartografados e devidamente caracterizados na cidade. Estamos a juntar tudo isto numa base digital para transformar numa app, o que para nós é muito importante porque vai permitir aos visitantes do museu e a todos os que usam o nosso site, enfim, as nossas plataformas sociais, para terem uma ferramenta para a descoberta da cidade de forma autónoma, mas devidamente informada. Isso é uma tarefa que abraçamos com todo o gosto. Na renovação do piso superior do Museu de Lisboa, vamos ter pela primeira vez conteúdos dedicados à escravatura. Isso é algo que é uma novidade no discurso do próprio museu, que se junta a outras semi-novidades. A Inquisição era já trabalhada no nosso museu, mas vamos reforçar esses conteúdos e também pela primeira vez vamos ter conteúdos dedicados à guerra colonial, ou seja, estamos a falar de áreas que foram minimizadas, que foram negligenciadas pela investigação histórica até há pouco tempo. Isto também nos dá esta outra perspectiva, que a escravatura não é a única área negligenciada pela historiografia dominante no nosso país e que há outras que também merecem o nosso olhar. E no dia 13 de julho vamos inaugurar um percurso digital associado à maquete de Lisboa anterior ao terremoto de 1755, que é uma das nossas peças de referência e uma das peças mais procuradas pelos visitantes do museu. São 7 minutos de documentário associado à maquete e que é complementada no dia 13 de julho. Vamos complementar este novo conteúdo digital associado a esta imensa maquete que vem aqui com uma visita dinamizada por parte da investigação do museu. Bom, este projeto do Shipwrecks surge para nós num momento muito importante, porque é um momento em que a área que nós começamos a desenvolver há alguns anos está consolidada na investigação do Museu de Lisboa e nós próprios estávamos a desenvolver conteúdos sobre estas figuras estranhas, obscuras, que podemos dar um nome genérico de negreiros e que são essenciais para perceber quer a política, quer a cidade no século XIX. E depois, como muitos deles, acabam por ser ocultados, deliberadamente ocultados, por familiares, por uma história que se pretende esconder, e de como é a nossa missão, de facto, trazer esses conteúdos para a ordem do dia e enfrentar a história, porque é isso que nós devemos fazer. Nós temos enfrentado a história na medida das nossas possibilidades e vamos continuar a fazê-lo e, neste caso, muito em concreto com a escravatura e com estes conteúdos, sobretudo esta questão do século XIX, que é uma questão para a qual nós temos vindo a trabalhar e que temos já, de facto, muita informação sobre estes negreiros, as famílias, enfim, depois todas estas ligações que a Raquel também falou um pouco. Mas claro está, eu queria também ouvir-vos um pouco sobre este assunto. Eu acho que aquilo que o projeto nos trouxe hoje é demasiado importante para Portugal estar à margem de todo este processo. Eu recordo aqui algumas palavras, por exemplo, do Kamal Siddiqui, que falou da história de uma amnésia. And I want to thank you, Kamal, for rescuing some of the history of an amnesia which we are now facing here in Portugal. Mas há, de facto, muitas outras matérias que nós devemos intervir a partir de Portugal e neste contexto em rede, porque, de facto, a história do paquete de São José, sendo apenas uma história dos muitos navios que fizeram este tráfico transatlântico é uma metáfora da tal história negligenciada. E nós, de facto, estamos, neste momento, em contexto em condições de descrever esta história global, não é? Esta história que é transcontinental, que junta a África, a América e a Europa, que faz uso dos recursos ao nosso dispor, desde a informação arquivística, a arqueologia convencional, como se viu com as aringas de Tete e com a cultura material que saiu dessas aringas, com a arqueologia subaquática, com os métodos de preservação material dos objetos, e de facto acho que estão criados contextos para que os investigadores portugueses e também os museus portugueses possam participar desta aventura que é resgatar a história, porque eu acho que é isso que estamos a falar, resgatando as vozes daqueles que não tiveram voz naquela altura. Rescuing the voices of those who didn't have voice at the time. Bom, vamos abrir o debate, penso eu, acho que já falei o suficiente, e quem quiser participar, eu acho que o melhor é levantar a mão e eu depois darei a voz a quem quiser participar, agradecendo muito todas as intervenções e agradecendo também, sobretudo, ao Paulo Gardulo pela clarividência da sua exposição e pela forma como nos interpelou a todos. I want to thank you, Paul Gardulo, for your clarity, for your intervention, and the way that you helped us to raise awareness, which is because I think this is what we are also talking about, raising awareness in our society. Já temos algumas pessoas inscritas, eu vou passar a palavra ao Alexandre Monteiro, agradecendo também muito a sua presença.
Paulo, antes do Alexandre falar, vamos dar prioridade ao Alexandre, depois à Inês e ao José Neves, uma vez que foram convidados para fazer parte da mesa redonda, e depois então abrimos ao resto da audiência, ok? Alexandre.
Então, se calhar começo eu, não?
Sim, sim.
Estão-me a ouvir? Estão-me a ouvir? Isto é o clássico do Zoom, estão-me a ouvir. Maybe I will talk in English so that people from the other side of the ocean can understand. It is really beneficial for us to all be here and discuss what is one of the many unknown aspects of Portuguese history. Besides the route to India, everything else is in kind of haze and it lacks research. One of the things that I was hearing Paulo Fernandes speaking now, and I am mainly a person of the archives. And I have watched what Yolanda Duarte did at Arquivo Histórico Ultramarino, and the determination that she had and the work that she did was quite gigantic. And I am still to see our academics begin the task of compiling, indexing, and archiving, and mainly transcribing these thousands of documents. That's what we need to do right now. At Arquivo da Torre do Tombo, they have been publishing a lot, like since the Monumenta Africana, for instance, for the 16th century, but everything regarding the slave trade in the 17th century, mainly in the 18th century, and even on the 19th century, there is thousands of theses to be done regarding what is there in the archives, which is not kept, it's not indexed, and it's not even transcribed. So I would just throw to the floor the challenge of our master students and PhD students to start digging at the archives. Let's do an archaeology of the archives, because the amount of information that is there and the detail of it is just staggering. Because and even reversing the question, I was in Mozambique in 2009 and I got interested in the miçangas, the velorio trade. And when I start looking at documentation in Portugal, I found out that there was a fashion for these miçangas. So the African ethnicities that were way in the interior of Mozambique would refuse to get a batch of miçangas that was out of fashion. So these people had agencies, and what they were thinking that was going to be in fashion for the next year would have an effect like in the Murano factories in Venice. So the taste of the African people in Mozambique would be having an impact in the next year production of miçangas. And the same thing applied to the panos. So there is a whole world of research to be done here, and is not just restricted to shipwrecks. There is a ton of things to do. That's just my input. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandre. And well, I strongly, I strongly believe that there's a lot to be done. And as you were speaking, I remember that 20 years ago in Portugal, people were very interested in the wreckings because of Carreira da Índia, especially because of it, and not because of slavery. And now we are turning the page. We are now focusing much more on slavery and less in Carreira da Índia, I hope. Bem, eu queria dar a palavra também ao José Neves, da Associação Batotoyeto, com o qual o Museu de Lisboa tem trabalhado. Ainda há dias fizemos uma visita partilhada entre o Museu de Lisboa e a Associação Batotoyeto. A associação tem trabalhado bastante a memória e a cultura africana em Lisboa, e é um gosto estar também aqui consigo. E, por favor, tenha a palavra.
Well, thank you for the words, Paulo. Thank you for the invitation, Raquel. Nice to see you all again, Kamal, and all the American representatives of this matter. It was very broad range of participants, and I was collecting information. And I'm Portuguese. My parents are from Cape Verde, so I'm the only one in the family who was born here in Portugal. And during the school time, I've never reached any kind of information similar to what we have been speaking here. And I think that would be a really life-changing moment for me or for other kids at that period. Now I'm a little bit older, but I think that the school system haven't changed from that period to now. So that was what I was connecting. And my kids, they have this history book, I don't know if you can see it well, where they represent this Egyptian history with an African featured girl. It's something that it's very new and a new approach, but at the same time, in other books, we have like really old-fashioned reference to African history, African memory. And I think it would be very interesting to bring this history to the school system, to the public. I don't know, maybe an exposition about the slave wreck projects, about the boat of São José, about all this history, because we grow up with the notion that the transatlantic slave trade was something that happened really far away from Portugal. It was something that happened in Africa, in Brazil, and we just had a relation with the products, not with the persons that were enslaved. Not like the impression that we didn't have slavery in Portugal itself. And I think it would be very interesting just to capacitate these young people that are growing up. Also, I think it would be it's very interesting that the boat it has been used for several representations. We learn it on the representations as the discoveries, as the maritime travelers, and recently we had other type of representations about the boats from Grada Quilomba, and this new investigation, this new information about this São José, I think it will be it can be an opportunity for us to understand this upgrade that happened in the slavery that happened in all the world has a war servitude, and it could be an opportunity for a new opportunity for Portugal, since it was one of the first countries to open to this kind of global village. It could be an opportunity also for us to open to this new dialogue that we have to do with other continents and with the overall history that we all share. So just to say that I was really impressed by all the information, and we do some travelers, some tours in Portugal, trying to uncover this hidden information that's not that hidden. It was always present. Sometimes we say we are discovering this history, but discovering something that already exists, maybe it's not the right word. So just to say that we have a lot to work, and to thank you all for this invitation and for this panel that is very interesting.
Thank you, José. Well, I prefer to use the word rescue, resgatar. I think we are rescuing memories and history that is uncovered. But anyway, I think it's been a journey doing all this research, and I believe that if you feel the same, that we are doing something very good for our common future. I want to give the word to 𝐻𝐧𝐥𝐢𝐧𝐼𝐻 𝐻𝐧𝐥𝐢𝐧𝐼𝐻. She's with us. Hi, 𝐻𝐻. She's with us because she did a master thesis on slave trading across the Atlantic in our university, in Nova University, and she was quite interested in her research about the tonnage of the slaves in ships. Hi, 𝐻𝐻. Thank you for being with us, and you have the word.
Thank you, Paulo. Thank you so much for inviting me. This has been a very interesting afternoon. It was quite curious to see some faces related to the names that I'm used to only associate to articles and books. It was quite nice to put a face on the names, and well, nice to meet you all. Yes, it's true. I did my master thesis about the slave trade, specifically about the ships of the trade. It was quite a hard task. Our national archive, the archive that is dedicated exclusively to the what's the name of the archive? Can I say it in English? No.
Say it in Portuguese.
Yeah, it's better. So the �𝐾 �histórico 𝐿 it's hard to translate it. I did my research mainly in that archive, and it was quite hard to find information about the slave ships. I saw one of my teachers here, but I think he left already, 𝐧𝐜𝐢𝐵𝐻𝐿. Yeah, I did subjects with him about slave ships. But now actually I'm a teacher, a history teacher. So it was quite interesting to hear José Neves talk about the books that children receive to study history here in Portugal. And I am not doing any research now. I am devoted to being a teacher, a history teacher, to teenagers, and I try to maintain this subject, this topic of slavery, and specifically slave trade and its implications on modern society, very present. I teach economic students, teenagers that are in they're 15, 16-year-olds, and they study economics. They have to choose an area, and they are economic students, and they have history as a complement. So I try to work to teach them a lot about this. It is in our national curriculum, but not in the profundidade, how do you say it? Depthness. Depth. Yeah. Okay. Not as it doesn't go as deep as it should. Specifically because, as José said, and it was really nice to hear his comment. Portugal was, and I don't know if I can see her name, Rodrigues Rosa. I don't know how you. You were saying it as well in your. Raquel, hi. You were saying as well. Portugal was the main nation involved in this traffic, and many of them I see every year. They are not aware of this fact. They are not aware of the implications that the slave trade and the slavery in Portugal and in Portuguese colonies had in our current society. So I try to force them sometimes to study more and to research more about this. I give them a lot of articles, some of them written by you, some of you are here, so they can become a little bit of history investigators and try to see more. And I also make them debate a lot about this according to our current values. I'm very looking forward, Paulo Fernandes, for that app you told us about. I think my students will love it. It's a really nice idea, and probably an amazing way to make them like the topic. It's not very easy sometimes, and it's usually it usually comes in school manuals as like a tiny paragraph, just with numbers, you see, not with real experiences. It doesn't give us real names, real lives. It just gives us a little paragraph with the numbers. So it makes it all very inhumane. You see, so I try as a teacher to insist in this, according, of course, to my previous experience researching the topic. So thank you very much for inviting me. It was really, really nice to be involved.
Thanks a lot, Inês, and good luck with that teaching process. Well, we have. I thank you all for your patience. We are here for 2 hours and 45 minutes, but we are now entering the debate, and we have well, I would like to hand the word over to Yolanda. Yolanda, feel free to say something. Yolanda, por favor.
Eu queria dizer que esta apresentação que eu fiz sobre o São José é só uma faceta do projeto, não é? O Slave Wreck Project é muito mais do que isto. Desde logo ajudou-nos numa luta de 14 anos, inclusive com o Alexandre Monteiro em Lisboa, contra os caça-tesouros, que tiveram um papel muito importante. O Slave Wreck Project, por exemplo, o relatório que permitiu correr com os caça-tesouros de Moçambique, foi feito com o patrocínio do Slave Wreck Project, inclusive com o trabalho dos próprios também investigadores. Os nossos parceiros internacionais que estão dentro do Slave Wreck muito contribuíram, também o Kamal Siddiqui e entre outros do DWP, que deram formação a arqueólogos moçambicanos que criaram verdadeiras capacidades para os arqueólogos nacionais, mas também para os monitores da ilha de Moçambique, como os primeiros, não é bem responsável, mas os que olham para o património, e também as autoridades, porque havia e há autoridades marítimas, como a Polícia Marítima, a Administração Marítima, que não tinham capacidade de fiscalização, porque a fiscalização não tinham capacidade de mergulho. É verdade que são poucos elementos das autoridades, mas em termos de mergulhadores aqui da ilha de Moçambique, da comunidade, são 15, já é alguma coisa. Além disso, foi através do Slave Wreck que foi possível criar o 𝐂𝐲𝐢𝐚 como centro de arqueologia, investigação e recursos da ilha de Moçambique, também capacitá-lo de equipamento de mergulho e não só, de laboratório, formação em conservação e de objetos arqueológicos. Inclusive tivemos a formação no 𝐂𝐲𝐢𝐚 na África do Sul, e todas estas entidades e todos estes elementos participaram nas investigações que aqui temos feito, investigações à volta do São José. Foram feitas bastantes apresentações e divulgações a nível nacional, a nível internacional, nos Estados Unidos, na Turquia, esta também não deixa de ser uma divulgação, na universidade, várias em Maputo, e ainda esta semana foi o dia do património dos museus, Dia Mundial dos Museus, e tivemos uma pequena representação do 𝐂𝐲𝐢𝐚, mas também uma apresentação do Slave Wreck Project. E pronto, era isto que eu queria dizer, é que era o Slave Wreck Project e a importância do Slave Wreck Project em Moçambique está muito para além desta pequena faceta que nós apresentamos. Muito obrigado.
Muito bem, obrigado Yolanda, obrigado também por nos mostrar um bocadinho mais essa perspectiva abrangente e de como também a comunidade está envolvida nos vossos processos. And I hand the word over to Sabrina. Thank you.
Yes, good afternoon, and thank you so much for a very well balanced and informative presentation. Thank you to all of you. I'd like to direct a question to Raquel, please. Could you share more about Portugal's and perhaps other nations' decisions to traverse the Indian Ocean and capture Africans from the eastern side of the continent? Thank you.
I'm not sure I'm the right person to answer to that question. Maybe Steve is more capacitated to do so. But I can say that the trade to the Indian Ocean was highly regulated by the Portuguese crown. So all the merchants had to stop through Lisbon before going to the Americas without any merchandise. And at some point, merchants like José António Pereira lobbied the crown to avoid that step and go straight from those waters, Indian waters, to the Americas. And we also know that the Indian part of this commerce, where these merchants would get cloths, was fundamental in the slave trade. So we usually think about the slave trade as a triangle linking Africa to Europe and the Americas, but the Asian trading was fundamental to actually be able to buy the slaves in Africa because of the cloths that were acquired there. So it's still a little bit understudied, especially the connections of Portuguese traders with that part of the world in connection to the slave trade. But we're doing some advances. Steve, I don't know if you want to add.
I can add just a couple things. I mean, I think there are many, the São José offers an opportunity to highlight this pivot that brought the Indian Ocean fully into, and East Africa fully into, the transatlantic trade. Predominantly 1794, we know that the São José was the first officially authorized Portuguese vessel that attempted that, because we know that the first one that arrived in Brazil, again, this is officially authorized, arrived the year after. So the São José was a failure in that respect. At the same time, shortly thereafter, the East African sources become so much more important to slave traders, in part because there's an increased effort to shut down the trade in West Africa. As in particular, the British played a role in sort of the abolition of the trade and various different treaties and actions made West Africa less a more difficult source for slave traders, particularly going to Cuba and going to Brazil. There was a shift to East Africa. And it's a story that's very interesting and that implicates, it's not just a Portuguese story, but here's a situation that is very much a Portuguese and a US story, because interestingly enough, it's the US flag that is often used in these in this trade that is going between places like Mozambique or further up the coast in East Africa and Brazil. And the reason for that is because after the War of 1812, it was the only flag the British would not board. So even though it's an illegal trade in America after 1808, for the next 50 years, the American flag is essential, along with collaboration with Portuguese merchants and Brazilian and Cuban plantation owners. This is the complex that brings 2 million more people into the transatlantic trade. And some of the investigations, I know 𝐿𝐴 has left here, but 𝐿𝐴 Rambelli, who we're in discussions with in Brazil, is looking precisely at a shipwreck that was one of these vessels that came from Mozambique to Brazil under an American captain who hailed from Maine. And so we're hoping, I think these highlight ways in which these individual investigations offer an ability for us to look at, again, repressed histories. Things, in North America was, and the United States was an absolutely essential player to the continuation of the slave trade from of all places, East Africa. And, these connections are ones that tie this history to Portugal, and they tie it to Brazil, and they tie it to North America, but they've been forgotten. And again, these are opportunities for us to step into these histories and recover them, reclaim them through particular types of individual stories and investigations like the 𝐿𝐴𝐚 or like the São José.
Okay, thank you, Stephen, for enlightening these global networks that link all Western countries in all this subject. Alexandre, do you want to say something, please?
Yeah, I was just adding on what Steve was saying. The difference between the East and the West Coast was basically the price. So these slaves were commodities. And so you have to remember that in Eastern Africa, the Arabs were there for centuries. And there was this huge slave trade that drew slaves from places like Mozambique and siphoned all of these slaves into Arabia and into the Middle East. The trouble for the demand supply part of the slave trade, which would be Caribbean islands and Brazil and Cuba mainly, was that taking slaves from the east coast of Africa was more expensive than taking them from the west coast. And this also because the trade commodities that you will be using into the west coast would be less expensive, mainly because the routes would be shortened, and the kind of trade objects, and mainly because you will be financing them with Brazilian products like, you know, firewater, gunpowder, guns, and cotton. This would be significantly less expensive. What you're going to find, as Steve has very well pointed, is that starting with the active involvement of the Royal Navy in the slave traffic suppression, then it becomes economically justifiable to go towards the east coast of Africa and bring all of the slaves into Brazil. Because up to then, what you are going to see is that you have the trade would be all exclusively dealt within the Indian Ocean, mainly with Mauritius and the other possessions of the French and the British in the Indian Ocean. And this is very interesting because it's like a very punctual movement, and as Steve was very well pointing, that the São José is one of the first examples of such a ship, and that's why it's really so important that we looking at the archaeological physical remains of this shipwreck, we can find not a pretext but another angle from which to tell the story. And he was saying, and it's quite true, we don't know almost nothing about all of these trades and the economical motivations behind this trade.
Okay, thank you, Alexandre. I think that at the end of the day, it was all just a matter of profit, and this is what the history can be resumed at. I don't know if anyone else wants to say something. We have no one else inscribed. If not, well, I'm handing the word to Raquel to finish, to close this session. Thank you all.
Parece que a Ilana tem qualquer coisa.
Não. Eu só queria dizer mais umas palavras, que para além do São José, estamos agora a investigar
Desculpe. Faz favor.
Estou a dizer que para além do São José, neste momento estamos a fazer a investigação do navio negreiro, l'Aurore, que naufragou na ilha de Moçambique em 1790, que também tem sido feito no âmbito do Slave Wreck Project. E tem envolvido as mesmas entidades, o DWP, o 𝐂𝐧𝐿, mas também o National Park Service nos Estados Unidos. Fizemos prospeção remota através do magnetómetro, já foi feito bartimetria e fizemos alguns testes SPIT, recolhemos algumas amostras para análise, nomeadamente chumbo e madeiras, que foram para ver o ID, não é? E estamos num bom caminho, e é isto. Muito obrigado.
Só para acrescentar, este será um navio também, uma história importante que vai mostrar outra faceta desta história global, porque é a história do navio que naufragou em parte, houve enorme perda de vida porque houve uma rebelião dos escravos o dia anterior. Então, portanto, uma história que nos dá também uma perspectiva sobre resistência, que também foi uma causa de grande parte dos naufrágios e também uma componente, às vezes, não tão bem salientada na historiografia como devia ser.
Thanks, Stephen. And now, Raquel, please.
Como não temos mais perguntas, acho que está na altura de fecharmos. São 6 horas em Portugal, 1 hora aqui em Washington DC, penso que 7 horas em Moçambique. Quero agradecer a todos, em particular o museu, por ter tornado isto possível, e a todos os que participaram, todos os que tiveram paciência para ficar até ao fim a ouvir-nos. E pronto, espero que possamos repetir eventos semelhantes com mais informações e que consigamos, a pouco e pouco, desafiar a história portuguesa a trazer-nos mais histórias destas que fazem muita falta. Muito obrigada.
Boa tarde, obrigada.
Boa tarde.
Boa tarde, obrigada.
Até a próxima.
Muito obrigada a todos. Ficamos em contacto.
Peace. Be well.